Chapter 51. The Revival of Hattie Starr. Engrossed in the pleasures and entertainments which Cowperwood's money was providing, Bernice had until recently given very little thought to her future. Cowperwood had been most liberal. "She is young," he once said to Mrs. Carter with an air of disinterested liberality, when they were talking about Bernice and her future. "She is an exquisite. Let her have her day. If she marries well, she can pay you back or me. But give her all she needs now." And he signed checks with the air of a gardener who is growing a wondrous orchid. The truth was that Mrs. Carter had become so fond of Bernice as an object of beauty, a prospective grande dame, that she would have sold her soul to see her well placed, and as the money to provide the dresses, setting, equipage had to come from somewhere, she had placed her spirit in subjection to Cowperwood, and pretended not to see the compromising position in which she was placing all that was near and dear to her. "Oh, you're so good," she more than once said to him, a mist of gratitude commingled with joy in her eyes. "I would never have believed it of anyone. But Bevy—" "An aesthete is an aesthete," Cowperwood replied. "They are rare enough. I like to see a spirit as fine as hers move untroubled. She will make her way." Seeing Lieutenant Braxmar in the foreground of Bernice's affairs, Mrs. Carter was foolish enough to harp on the matter in a friendly, ingratiating way. Braxmar was really interested after his fashion. He was young, tall, muscular, and handsome, a graceful dancer. But better yet, he represented in his moods, lineage, social position, a number of the things which engaged Bernice most. He was intelligent, serious, with a kind of social grace which was gay, courteous, wistful. Bernice met him first at a local dance, where a new step was being practised. Dancing in the barn, as it was called, and so airily did he tread it with her in his handsome uniform that she was half smitten for the moment. "You dance delightfully," she said. "Is this a part of your life on the ocean wave?" "Deep-sea-going dancing," he replied with a heavy smile. "All battles are accompanied by balls, don't you know?" "Oh, what a wretched jest," she replied. "It's unbelievably bad." "Not for me. I can make much worse ones." "Not for me," she replied. "I can't stand them." And they went prancing on. Afterward he came and sat by her. They walked in the moonlight. He told her of naval life, his southern home and connections. Mrs. Carter, seeing him with Bernice and having been introduced, observed the next morning, "I like your Lieutenant Bevy. I know some of his relatives well. They come from the Carolinas. He's sure to come into money. The whole family is wealthy. Do you think he might be interested in you?" "Oh, possibly, yes, I presume so," replied Bernice airily, for she did not take too kindly to this evidence of parental interest. She preferred to see life drift on in some nebulous way at present, and this was bringing matters too close to home. "Still, he has so much machinery on his mind, I doubt whether he could take any serious interest in a woman. He's almost more of a battleship than he is a man." She made a mouth, and Mrs. Carter commented gaily, "You rogue! All the men take an interest in you. You don't think you could care for him, then, at all?" "Why, Mother, what a question! Why do you ask? Is it so essential that I should?" "Oh, not that exactly," replied Mrs. Carter sweetly, bracing herself for a word which she felt incumbent upon her. "But think of his position. He comes of such a good family, and he must be heir to a considerable fortune in his own right. Oh, Bevy, I don't want to hurry or spoil your life in any way, but do keep in mind the future. With your tastes and instincts, money is so essential, and unless you marry it, I don't know where you are to get it. Your father was so thoughtless, and Rolf's was even worse." She sighed. Bernice, for almost the first time in her life, took solemn heed of this thought. She pondered whether she could endure Braxmar as a life partner, follow him around the world, perhaps transferring her abode to the south. But she could not make up her mind. This suggestion on the part of a mother rather poisoned the cup for her. To tell the truth, in this hour of doubt her thoughts turned vaguely to Cowperwood, as one who represented, in his avid way, more of the things she truly desired. She remembered his wealth, his plaint that his new house could be only a museum, the manner in which he approached her with looks and voiceless suggestion. But he was old and married, Out of the question, therefore. And Braxmar was young and charming. To think her mother should have been so tactless as to suggest the necessity for consideration in his case. It almost spoiled him for her. And was their financial state, then, as uncertain as her mother indicated? In this crisis, some of her previous social experiences became significant. For instance, only a few weeks previous to her meeting with Braxmar, she had been visiting at the country estate of the Cowperwood Batchers, at Redding Hills, Long Island, and had been sitting with her hostess in the morning room of Hillcrest, which commanded a lovely, though distant view of Long Island Sound. Mrs. Frederica Batcher was a chestnut blonde, fair, cool, quiescent, a type out of Dutch art. Clad in a morning gown of grey and silver, her hair piled in a Psyche knot, she had in her lap on this occasion a Java basket, filled with some attempt at Norwegian needlework. "Bevi," she said, "you remember Kilmer Dwelmer, don't you? Wasn't he at the Haggertys last summer, when you were there?" Bernice, who was seated at a small Chippendale writing desk penning letters, glanced up, her mind visioning for the moment the youth in question. Kilmer Dwelmer, tall, stocky, swaggering, his clothes the loose, nonchalant perfection of the season, his walk ambling, studied, lackadaisical, aimless, his colour high, his cheeks full, his eyes a little vacuous, his mind acquiescing, in a sort of genial, inconsequential way, to every query and thought that was put to him. The younger of the two sons of Auguste Dwelmer, banker, promoter, multi-millionaire, he would come into a fortune estimated roughly at between 6 and 8 millions. At the Haggertys, the year before, he had hung about her in an aimless fashion. Mrs. Batcher studied Bernice curiously for a moment, then returned to her needlework. "I've asked him to come down over this weekend," she suggested. "Yes?" queried Bernice sweetly. "Are there others?" "Of course," assented Mrs. Batcher remotely. "Kilmer doesn't interest you, I presume?" Bernice smiled enigmatically. "You remember Clarissa Faulkner, don't you, Bevi?" pursued Mrs. Batcher. "She married Romulus Garrison." "Perfectly. Where is she now?" "They have leased the Chateau Breuil in Ars for the winter. Romulus is a fool, but Clarissa is so clever. You know she writes that she is holding a veritable court there this season. Half the smart set of Paris and London are dropping in. It is so charming for her to be able to do these things now. Poor dear. At one time I was quite troubled over her." Without giving any outward sign, Bernice did not fail to gather the full import of the analogy. It was all true. One must begin early to take thought of one's life. She suffered a disturbing sense of duty. Kilmer Dwelmer arrived at noon Friday, with 6 types of bags, a special valet, and a preposterous enthusiasm for polo and hunting, diseases lately acquired from a hunting set in the Berkshires. A cleverly contrived compliment, supposed to have emanated from Miss Fleming and conveyed to him with tact by Mrs. Batcher, brought him ambling into Bernice's presence, suggesting a Sunday drive to Saddle Rock. "Ha ha! You know, I'm delighted to see you again. Ha ha! It's been an age since I've seen the Haggertys. We missed you after you left. Ha ha! I did, you know. Since I saw you, I've taken up polo. 3 ponies with me all the time now. Ha ha! A regular stable nearby." Bernice strove valiantly to retain a serene interest. Duty was in her mind. The Chateau Breuil, the winter court of Clarissa Garrison, some first premonitions of the flight of time. Yet the drive was a bore, conversation a burden, the struggle to respond titanic, impossible. When Monday came, she fled, leaving 3 days between that and the weekend at Morristown. Mrs. Batcher, who read straws most capably, sighed. Her own Cowperwood was not much beyond his money, but life must be lived, and the ambitious must inherit wealth or gather it wisely. Some impossible, scheming silly would soon collect Dwelmer, and then— She considered Bernice a little difficult. Bernice could not help piecing together the memory of this incident with her mother's recent appeal in behalf of Lieutenant Braxmar. A great, cloying, disturbing, disintegrating factor in her life was revealed by the dawning discovery that she and her mother were without much money, that, aside from her lineage, she was in a certain sense an interloper in society. There were never rumors of great wealth in connection with her, no flattering whispers or public notices regarding her station as an heiress. All the smug minor mannequins of the social world were on the qui-vive for some cotton-headed doll of a girl with an endless bank account. By nature sybaritic, an intense lover of art, fabrics, of stately functions, of power and success in every form, she had been dreaming all this while of a great soul freedom, and art freedom, under some circumstances, as the greatest individual wealth of the day, and only that, could provide. Simultaneously, she had vaguely cherished the idea that if she ever found someone who was truly fond of her, and whom she could love or even admire intensely, someone who needed her in a deep, sincere way, she would give herself freely and gladly. Yet who could it be? She had been charmed by Braxmar, but her keen, analytic intelligence required someone harder, more vivid, more ruthless, someone who would appeal to her as an immense force. Yet she must be conservative. She must play what cards she had to win. During his summer visit at Narragansett, Cowperwood had not been long disturbed by the presence of Braxmar, for having received special orders, the latter was compelled to hurry away to Hampton Roads. But the following November, forsaking temporarily his difficult affairs in Chicago for New York and the Carter apartment in Central Park South, Cowperwood again encountered the lieutenant, who arrived one evening brilliantly arrayed in full official regalia in order to escort Bernice to a ball. A high military cap surmounting his handsome face, his epaulettes gleaming in gold, the lapels of his cape thrown back to reveal a handsome red silken lining, his sword clanking by his side, he seemed a veritable singing flame of youth. Cowperwood, caught in the drift of circumstances, age, unsuitableness, the flaring counter-attractions of romance and vigor, fairly writhed in pain. Bernice was so beautiful in a storm of diaphanous, clinging garments. He stared at them from an adjacent room where he pretended to be reading, and sighed. Alas, how was his cunning and foresight, even his, to overcome the drift of life itself? How was he to make himself appealing to youth? Braxmar had the years, the color, the bearing. Bernice seemed tonight, as she prepared to leave, to be fairly seething with youth, hope, gaiety. He arose after a few moments, and, giving business as an excuse, hurried away. But it was only to sit in his own rooms in a neighboring hotel and meditate. The logic of the ordinary man under such circumstances, compounded of the age-old notions of chivalry, self-sacrifice, duty to higher impulses, and the like, would have been to step aside in favor of youth, to give convention its day, and retire in favor of morality and virtue. Cowperwood saw things in no such moralistic or altruistic light. "I satisfy myself" had ever been his motto, and under that, however much he might sympathize with Bernice in love, or with love itself, he was not content to withdraw until he was sure that the end of hope for him had really come. There had been moments between him and Bernice, little approximations toward intimacy, which had led him to believe that by no means was she seriously opposed to him. At the same time, this business of the lieutenant, so Mrs. Carter confided to him a little later, was not to be regarded lightly. While Bernice might not care so much, obviously Braxmar did. "Ever since he has been away, he has been storming her with letters," she remarked to Cowperwood one afternoon. "I don't think he is the kind that can be made to take no for an answer." "A very successful kind," commented Cowperwood dryly. Mrs. Carter was eager for advice in the matter. Braxmar was a man of parts. She knew his connections. He would inherit at least $600,000 at his father's death, if not more. What about her Louisville record? Supposing that should come out later, would it not be wise for Bernice to marry and have the danger over with? "It is a problem, isn't it?" observed Cowperwood calmly. "Are you sure she's in love?" "Oh, I wouldn't say that. But such things so easily turn into love. I've never believed that Bernice could be swept off her feet by anyone. She is so thoughtful, but she knows she has her own way to make in the world, and Mr. Braxmar is certainly eligible. I know his cousins, the Clifford Porters, very well." Cowperwood knitted his brows. He was sick to his soul with this worry over Bernice. He felt that he must have her, even at the cost of inflicting upon her a serious social injury. Better that she should surmount it with him than escape it with another. It so happened, however, that the final grim necessity of acting on such an idea was spared him. Imagine a dining room at one of the principal hotels of New York, the hour midnight, after an evening at the opera to which Cowperwood, as host, had invited Bernice, Lieutenant Braxmar, and Mrs. Carter. He was now playing the role of disinterested host and avuncular mentor. His attitude toward Bernice, meditating as he was a course which should be destructive to Braxmar, was gentle, courteous, serenely thoughtful. Like a true Mephistopheles, he was waiting, surveying Mrs. Carter and Bernice, who were seated in front chairs, clad in such exotic draperies as opera-goers affect, Mrs. Carter in pale lemon silk and diamonds, Bernice in purple and old rose, with a jewelled comb in her hair. The lieutenant in his dazzling uniform smiled and talked blandly, complimented the singers, whispered pleasant nothings to Bernice, descanted at odd moments to Cowperwood on naval personages who happened to be present. Coming out of the opera and driving through blowy, windy streets to the Waldorf, they took the table reserved for them, and Cowperwood, after consulting with regard to the dishes and ordering the wine, went back reminiscently to the music, which had been La Bohème. The death of Mimi and the grief of Rodolphe, as voiced by the splendid melodies of Puccini, interested him. That makeshift studio world may have no connection with the genuine professional artist, but it's certainly very representative of life, he remarked. I don't know, I'm sure, said Braxmar seriously. All I know of Bohemia is what I've read in books. Trilby, for instance, and— He could think of no other, and stopped. I suppose it is that way in Paris. He looked at Bernice for confirmation, and to win a smile. Owing to her mobile and sympathetic disposition, she had during the opera been swept from period to period by surges of beauty too gay or pathetic for words, but clearly comprehended of the spirit. Once, when she had been lost in dreamy contemplation, her hands folded on her knees, her eyes fixed on the stage, both Braxmar and Cowperwood had studied her parted lips and fine profile with common impulses of emotion and enthusiasm. Realizing after the mood was gone that they had been watching her, Bernice had continued the pose for a moment, then had waked as from a dream with a sigh. This incident now came back to her, as well as her feeling in regard to the opera generally. "It is very beautiful," she said. "I do not know what to say. People are like that, of course. It is so much better than just dull comfort. Life is really finest when it's tragic, anyhow." She looked at Cowperwood, who was studying her, then at Braxmar, who saw himself for the moment on the captain's bridge of a battleship, commanding in time of action. To Cowperwood came back many of his principal moments of difficulty. Surely his life had been sufficiently dramatic to satisfy her. "I don't think I care so much for it," interposed Mrs. Carter. "One gets tired of sad happenings. We have enough drama in real life." Cowperwood and Braxmar smiled faintly. Bernice looked contemplatively away. The crush of diners, the clink of china and glass, the bustling to and fro of waiters, and the strumming of the orchestra diverted her somewhat, as did the nods and smiles of some entering guests who recognized Braxmar and herself, but not Cowperwood. Suddenly, from a neighboring door, opening from the men's cafe and grill, there appeared the semi-intoxicated figure of an ostensibly swagger society man, his clothing somewhat awry, his opera coat hanging loosely from one shoulder, a crush opera hat dangling in one hand, his eyes a little bloodshot, his under lip protruding slightly and defiantly, and his whole visage proclaiming that devil-may-care superior and malicious aspect which the drunken rake does not so much assume as achieve. He looked sullenly, uncertainly about, then, perceiving Cowperwood and his party, made his way thither in the half-determined, half-inconsequential fashion of one not quite sound after his cups. When he was directly opposite Cowperwood's table, the cynosure of a number of eyes, he suddenly paused as if in recognition, and coming over, laid a genial and yet condescending hand on Mrs. Carter's bare shoulder. "Why, hello, Hattie," he called leeringly and jeeringly. "What are you doing down here in New York? You haven't given up your business in Louisville, have you, old sport? Say, let me tell you something. I haven't had a single decent girl since you left, not one. If you open a house down here, let me know, will you?" He bent over her smirkingly and patronizingly, the while he made as if to rummage in his white waistcoat pocket for a card. At the same moment Cowperwood and Braxmar, realizing quite clearly the import of his words, were on their feet. While Mrs. Carter was pulling and struggling back from the stranger, Braxmar's hand, he being the nearest, was on him, and the head waiter and 2 assistants had appeared. "What is the trouble here? What has he done?" they demanded. Meanwhile the intruder, leering contentiously at them all, was exclaiming in very audible tones, "Take your hands off! Who are you? What the devil have you got to do with this? Don't you think I know what I'm about? She knows me, don't you, Hattie? That's Hattie Starr of Louisville. Ask her. She kept one of the swellest ever run in Louisville. What do you people want to be so upset about? I know what I'm doing. She knows me." He not only protested but contested with some vehemence. Cowperwood, Braxmar, and the waiters forming a cordon, he was shoved and hustled out into the lobby and the outer entranceway, and an officer was called. "This man should be arrested," Cowperwood protested vigorously when the latter appeared. "He has grossly insulted lady guests of mine. He is drunk and disorderly, and I wish to make that charge. Here is my card. Will you let me know where to come?" He handed it over, while Braxmar, scrutinizing the stranger with military care, added, "I should like to thrash you within an inch of your life. If you weren't drunk, I would. If you are a gentleman, and have a card, I want you to give it to me. I want to talk to you later." He leaned over and presented a cold, hard face to that of Mr. Beals Chadsey of Louisville, Kentucky. "That's all right, Captain," leered Chadsey mockingly. "I got a card. No harm done. Here you are. You can see me any time you want. Hotel Buckingham, 5th Avenue and 50th Street. I got a right to speak to anybody I please, where I please, when I please, see?" He fumbled and protested while the officer stood by, ready to take him in charge. Not finding a card, he added, "That's all right. Write it down. Beals Chadsey, Hotel Buckingham, or Louisville, Kentucky. See me any time you want to. That's Hattie Starr. She knows me. I couldn't make a mistake about her. Not once in a million. Many's the night I spent in her house." Braxmar was quite ready to lunge at him, had not the officer intervened. Back in the dining room, Bernice and her mother were sitting, the latter quite flushed, pale, distrait, horribly taken aback, by far too much distressed for any convincing measure of deception.
"Why, the very idea," she was saying. "That dreadful man, how terrible! I never saw him before in my life."
Bernice, disturbed and nonplussed, was thinking of the familiar and lecherous leer with which the stranger had addressed her mother, the horror, the shame of it. Could even a drunken man, if utterly mistaken, be so defiant, so persistent, so willing to explain? What shameful things had she been hearing? "Come, mother," she said gently and with dignity. "Never mind. It is all right. We can go home at once. You will feel better when you are out of here." She called a waiter and asked him to say to the gentleman that they had gone to the women's dressing-room. She pushed an intervening chair out of the way and gave her mother her arm.
"To think I should be so insulted," Mrs. Carter mumbled on. "Here in a great hotel in the presence of Lieutenant Braxmar and Mr. Cowperwood. This is too dreadful. Well, I never."
She half whimpered as she walked, and Bernice, surveying the room with dignity, a lofty superiority in her face, led solemnly forth, a strange, lacerating pain about her heart. What was at the bottom of these shameful statements? Why should this drunken roisterer have selected her mother of all other women in the dining-room for the object of these outrageous remarks? Why should her mother be stricken, so utterly collapsed, if there were not some truth in what he had said? It was very strange, very sad, very grim, very horrible. What would that gossiping, scandal-loving world, of which she knew so much, say to a scene like this? For the first time in her life the import and horror of social ostracism flashed upon her. The following morning, owing to a visit paid to the Jefferson Market Police Court by Lieutenant Braxmar, where he proposed, if satisfaction were not immediately guaranteed, to empty cold lead into Mr. Beals Chadsey's stomach, The following letter, on Buckingham stationery, was written and sent to Mrs. Ira George Carter, 36 Central Park South. Dear Madam, last evening, owing to a drunken debauch, for which I have no satisfactory or suitable explanation to make, I was the unfortunate occasion of an outrage upon your feelings and those of your daughter and friends, for which I wish most humbly to apologize. I cannot tell you how sincerely I regret whatever I said or did, which I cannot now clearly recall. My mental attitude when drinking is both contentious and malicious, and while in this mood and state I was the author of statements which I know to be wholly unfounded. In my drunken stupor I mistook you for a certain notorious woman of Louisville. Why, I have not the slightest idea. For this wholly shameful and outrageous conduct I sincerely ask your pardon, beg your forgiveness. I do not know what amends I can make, but anything you may wish to suggest I shall gladly do. In the meanwhile, I hope you will accept this letter in the spirit in which it is written, and as a slight attempt to recompense, which I know can never fully be made. Very sincerely, Beals Chadsey. At the same time, Lieutenant Braxmar was fully aware before this letter was written or sent that the charges implied against Mrs. Carter were only too well founded. Beals Chadsey had said drunk what 20 men in all sobriety and even the police at Louisville would corroborate. Chadsey had insisted on making this clear to Braxmar before writing the letter. Chapter 52. Behind the Arras. Bernice, perusing the apology from Beals Chadsey which her mother, very much fagged and weary, handed her the next morning, thought that it read like the overnight gallantry of someone who was seeking to make amends without changing his point of view. Mrs. Carter was too obviously self-conscious. She protested too much. Bernice knew that she could find out for herself if she chose. But would she choose? The thought sickened her. And yet who was she to judge too severely? Cowperwood came in bright and early to put as good a face on the matter as he could. He explained how he and Braxmar had gone to the police station to make a charge, how Chadsey, sobered by arrest, had abandoned his bravado and humbly apologized. When viewing the letter handed him by Mrs. Carter, he explained, "Oh, yes. He was very glad to promise to write that if we would let him go. Braxmar seemed to think it was necessary that he should. I wanted the judge to impose a fine and let it go at that. He was drunk, and that's all there was to it." He assumed a very unknowing air when in the presence of Bernice and her mother, but when alone with the latter his manner changed completely. "Brazen it out," he commanded. "It doesn't amount to anything. Braxmar doesn't believe that this man really knows anything. This letter is enough to convince Bernice. Put a good face on it. More depends on your manner than on anything else. You're much too upset. That won't do at all. You'll tell the whole story that way." At the same time he privately regarded this incident as a fine windfall of chance. In all likelihood, the one thing which would serve to scare the lieutenant away. Outwardly, however, he demanded effrontery, assumption, and Mrs. Carter was somewhat cheered. But when she was alone, she cried. Bernice, coming upon her accidentally and finding her eyes wet, exclaimed, "Oh, Mother, please don't be foolish. How can you act this way? We had better go up in the country and rest a little while if you are so unstrung." Mrs. Carter protested that it was merely nervous reaction, but to Bernice it seemed that where there was so much smoke there must be some fire. Her manner in the aftermath toward Braxmar was gracious but remote. He called the next day to say how sorry he was, and to ask her to a new diversion. She was sweet but distant. Insofar as she was concerned, it was plain that the Beals Chadsey incident was closed, but she did not accept his invitation. "Mother and I are planning to go to the country for a few days," she observed genially. "I can't say just when we shall return, but if you are still here we shall meet, no doubt. You must be sure to come and see us." She turned to an East Court window, where the morning sun was gleaming on some flowers in a window box, and began to pinch off a dead leaf here and there. Braxmar, full of the tradition of American romance, captivated by her vibrant charm, her poise and superiority under the circumstances, her obvious readiness to dismiss him, was overcome, as the human mind frequently is, by a riddle of the spirit, a chemical reaction as mysterious to its victim as to one who is its witness. Stepping forward, with a motion that was at once gallant, reverent, eager, unconscious, he exclaimed. "Bernice! Miss Fleming! Please don't send me away like this. Don't leave me. It isn't anything I have done, is it? I'm mad about you. I can't bear to think that anything that has happened could make any difference between you and me. I haven't had the courage to tell you before, but I want to tell you now. I've been in love with you from the very first night I saw you. You are such a wonderful girl. I don't feel that I deserve you, but I love you. I love you with all the honor and force in me. I admire and respect you. Whatever may or may not be true, it is all one and the same to me. Be my wife, will you? Marry me, please. Oh, I'm not fit to be the lacer of your shoes, but I have position, and I'll make a name for myself, I hope. Oh, Bernice!" He extended his arms in a dramatic fashion, not outward but downward, stiff and straight, and declared, "I don't know what I shall do without you. Is there no hope for me at all?" An artist in all the graces of sex, histrionic, plastic, many-faceted, Bernice debated for the fraction of a minute what she should do and say. She did not love the lieutenant, as he loved her by any means, and somehow this discovery concerning her mother shamed her pride, suggesting an obligation to save herself in one form or another, which she resented bitterly. She was sorry for his tactless proposal at this time, although she knew well enough the innocence and virtue of the emotion from which it sprung. "Really, Mr. Braxmar," she replied, turning on him with solemn eyes, "you mustn't ask me to decide that now. I know how you feel. I'm afraid, though, that I may have been a little misleading in my manner. I didn't mean to be. I'm quite sure you'd better forget your interest in me for the present, anyhow. I could only make up my mind in one way if you should insist. I should have to ask you to forget me entirely. I wonder if you can see how I feel, how it hurts me to say this." She paused, perfectly poised, yet quite moved, really, as charming a figure as one would have wished to see, part Greek, part Oriental, contemplative, calculating. In that moment, for the first time, Braxmar realized that he was talking to someone whom he could not comprehend, really. She was strangely self-contained, enigmatic, more beautiful, perhaps, because more remote than he had ever seen her before. In a strange flash, this young American saw the isles of Greece, Cytherea, the lost Atlantis, Cyprus, and its Paphian shrine. His eyes burned with a strange, comprehending luster. His colour, at first high, went pale. "I can't believe you don't care for me at all, Miss Bernice," he went on quite strainedly. "I felt you did care about me. But here," he added all at once, with a real, if summoned, military force, "I won't bother you. You do understand me. You know how I feel. I won't change. Can't we be friends, anyhow?" He held out his hand, and she took it, feeling now that she was putting an end to what might have been an idyllic romance. "Of course we can," she said. "I hope I shall see you again soon." After he was gone, she walked into the adjoining room and sat down in a wicker chair, putting her elbows on her knees and resting her chin in her hands. What a denouement to a thing so innocent, so charming. And now he was gone. She would not see him any more, would not want to see him. Not much, anyhow. Life had sad, even ugly facts. Oh, yes, and she was beginning to perceive them clearly. Some 2 days later, when Bernice had brooded and brooded until she could endure it no longer, she finally went to Mrs. Carter and said, "Mother, something is worrying you. Can't you trust me? I'm no longer a child, by any means, and I am your daughter. It may help me to straighten things out, to know what to do." Mrs. Carter, who had always played a game of lofty, though loving, motherhood, was greatly taken aback by this courageous attitude. She flushed and chilled a little, then decided to lie. "I tell you there was nothing at all," she declared nervously and pettishly. "It is all an awful mistake. I wish that dreadful man could be punished severely for what he said to me, to be outraged and insulted this way before my own child." "Mother?" questioned Bernice, fixing her with those cool blue eyes. "Why don't you tell me all about Louisville? You and I shouldn't have things between us. Maybe I can help you." All at once Mrs. Carter, realizing that her daughter was no longer a child, nor a mere social butterfly, but a woman, superior, cool, sympathetic, with intuitions much deeper than her own, sank into a heavily flowered wing chair behind her, and, seeking a small pocket handkerchief with one hand, placed the other over her eyes and began to cry.
I was so driven, Bevy. I didn't know which way to turn. Colonel Gillis suggested it. I wanted to keep you and Rolf in school and give you a chance. It isn't true. Anything that horrible man said. It wasn't anything like what he suggested. Colonel Gillis and several others wanted me to rent them bachelor quarters, and that's the way it all came about. It wasn't my fault. I couldn't help myself, Bevy.
"And what about Mr. Cowperwood?" inquired Bernice curiously. She had begun of late to think a great deal about Cowperwood. He was so cool, deep, dynamic, in a way resourceful like herself.
"There's nothing about him,"
replied Mrs. Carter, looking up defensively. Of all her men friends she best liked Cowperwood. He had never advised her to evil ways, or used her house as a convenience to himself alone.
"He never did anything but help me out. He advised me to give up my house in Louisville and come east and devote myself to looking after you and Rolf. He offered to help me until you should be able to help yourselves, and so I came. Oh, if only I had not been so foolish, so afraid of life. But your father and Mr. Carter just ran through everything."
She heaved a deep, heartfelt sigh. "Then we really haven't anything at all, have we, Mother? Property or anything else?" Mrs. Carter shook her head, meaning no. "And the money we have been spending is Mr. Cowperwood's?"
"Yes."
Bernice paused and looked out the window over the wide stretch of park which it commanded. Framed in it like a picture were a small lake, a hill of trees, with a Japanese pagoda effect in the background. Over the hill were the yellow towering walls of a great hotel in Central Park West. In the street below could be heard the jingle of streetcars. On the road in the park could be seen a moving line of pleasure vehicles, society taking an airing in the chill November afternoon. Poverty, ostracism, she thought. And should she marry rich? Of course, if she could. And whom should she marry? The lieutenant? Never. He was really not masterful enough mentally, and he had witnessed her discomfiture. And who, then? Oh, the line of sillies, lightweights, rakes, ne'er-do-wells, who, combined with sober, prosperous, conventional, muddle-headed oafs, constituted society. Here and there, at far jumps, was a real man, but would he be interested in her if he knew the whole truth about her?
"Have you broken with Mr. Braxmar?"
asked her mother curiously, nervously, hopefully, hopelessly. "I haven't seen him since," replied Bernice, lying conservatively. "I don't know whether I shall or not. I want to think." She arose. "But don't you mind, Mother? Only I wish we had some other way of living besides being dependent on Mr. Cowperwood." She walked into her boudoir, and before her mirror began to dress for a dinner to which she had been invited. So it was Cowperwood's money that had been sustaining them all during the last few years, and she had been so liberal with his means, so proud, vain, boastful, superior, and he had only fixed her with those inquiring, examining eyes. Why? But she did not need to ask herself why. She knew now. What a game he had been playing, and what a silly she had been not to see it. Did her mother in any way suspect? She doubted it. This queer, paradoxical, impossible world. The eyes of Cowperwood burned at her as she thought. Chapter 53. A Declaration of Love. For the first time in her life, Bernice now pondered seriously what she could do. She thought of marriage, but decided that instead of sending for Braxmar or taking up some sickening chase of an individual even less satisfactory, it might be advisable to announce, in a simple social way to her friends, that her mother had lost her money, and that she herself was now compelled to take up some form of employment. The teaching of dancing, perhaps, or the practice of it professionally. She suggested this calmly to her mother one day. Mrs. Carter, who had been long a parasite, really, without any constructive monetary notions of real import, was terrified. To think that she, and Bevy, her wonderful daughter, and by reaction her son, should come to anything so humdrum and prosaic as ordinary, struggling life, and after all her dreams. She sighed and cried in secret, writing to Cowperwood a cautious explanation, and asking him to see her privately in New York when he returned.
"Don't you think we had best go on a little while longer?" she suggested to Bernice. "It just wrings my heart to think that you, with all your qualifications, should have to stoop to giving dancing lessons. We had better do almost anything for a while yet. You can make a suitable marriage, and then everything will be all right for you. It doesn't matter about me. I can live, but you—"
Mrs. Carter's strained eyes indicated the misery she felt. Bernice was moved by this affection for her, which she knew to be genuine. But what a fool her mother had been. What a weak reed, indeed, she was to lean upon. Cowperwood, when he conferred with Mrs. Carter, insisted that Bernice was quixotic, nervously awry, to wish to modify her state, to eschew society and invalidate her wondrous charm by any sort of professional life. By prearrangement with Mrs. Carter, he hurried to Pocono at a time when he knew that Bernice was there alone. Ever since the Beals-Chadsey incident, she had been evading him. When he arrived, as he did about 1 in the afternoon of a crisp January day, there was snow on the ground, and the surrounding landscape was bathed in a crystalline light that gave back to the eye endless facets of luster, jewel beams that cut space with a flash. The automobile had been introduced by now, and he rode in a touring car of 80 horsepower that gave back from its dark brown varnished surface a lacquered light. In a great fur coat and cap of round, black lamb's wool, he arrived at the door. "Well, Bevy," he exclaimed, pretending not to know of Mrs. Carter's absence. "How are you? How's your mother? Is she in?" Bernice fixed him with her cool, steady-gazing eyes, as frank and incisive as they were daring, and smiled him an equivocal welcome. She wore a blue denim painter's apron, and a palette of many colors glistened under her thumb. She was painting and thinking being her special occupation these days, and her thoughts had been of Braxmar, Cowperwood, Kilmer-Dwelmer, a half-dozen others, as well as of the stage, dancing, painting. Her life was in a melting pot, as it were, before her. Again, it was like a disarranged puzzle, the pieces of which might be fitted together into some interesting picture if she could but endure. "Do come in," she said. "It's cold, isn't it? Well, there's a nice fire here for you. No, Mother isn't here. She went down to New York. I should think you might have found her at the apartment. Are you in New York for long?" She was gay, cheerful, genial, but remote. Cowperwood felt the protective gap that lay between him and her. It had always been there. He felt that, even though she might understand and like him, yet there was something, convention, ambition, or some deficiency on his part, that was keeping her from him, keeping her eternally distant. He looked about the room, at the picture she was attempting, a snowscape of a view down a slope, at the view itself which he contemplated from the window, at some dancing sketches she had recently executed and hung on the wall for the time being, lovely short tunic motifs. He looked at her in her interesting and becoming painter's apron. "Well, Bernice," he said, "always the artist first. It is your world. You will never escape it. These things are beautiful." He waved an ungloved hand in the direction of a choric line. "It wasn't your mother I came to see, anyhow. It is you. I had such a curious letter from her. She tells me you want to give up society and take to teaching or something of that sort. I came because I wanted to talk to you about that. Don't you think you are acting rather hastily?" He spoke now as though there were some reason entirely disassociated from himself that was impelling him to this interest in her. Bernice, brush in hand, standing by her picture, gave him a look that was cool, curious, defiant, equivocal. "No, I don't think so," she replied quietly. "You know how things have been, so I may speak quite frankly. I know that Mother's intentions were always of the best." Her mouth moved with the faintest touch of sadness. "My heart, I'm afraid, is better than her head. As for your motives, I am satisfied to believe that they have been of the best also. I know that they have been, in fact. It would be ungenerous of me to suggest anything else." Cowperwood's fixed eyes, it seemed to her, had moved somewhere in their deepest depths. "Yet I don't feel we can go on as we have been doing. We have no money of our own. Why shouldn't I do something? What else can I really do?" She paused, and Cowperwood gazed at her quite still, in her informal, bunchy painter's apron, and with her blue eyes looking out at him from beneath her loose red hair. It seemed to him she was the most perfect thing he had ever known. Such a keen, fixed, enthroned mind. She was so capable, so splendid, and like his own, her eyes were unafraid. Her spiritual equipoise was undisturbed. "Bernice," he said quietly, "let me tell you something." You did me the honor just now to speak of my motives in giving your mother money as of the best. They were, from my own point of view, the best I've ever known. I will not say what I thought they were in the beginning. I know what they were now. I'm going to speak quite frankly with you, if you will let me, as long as we are here together. I don't know whether you know this or not, but when I first met your mother I only knew by chance she had a daughter, and it was of no particular interest to me then. I went to her house as the guest of a financial friend of mine who admired her greatly. From the first, I myself admired her, because I found her to be a lady to the manner born. She was interesting. One day I happened to see a photograph of you in her home, and before I could mention it, she put it away. Perhaps you recall the one. It is in profile, taken when you're about 16. Yes, I remember, replied Bernice simply, as quietly as though she were hearing a confession. Well, that picture interested me intensely. I inquired about you and learned all I could. After that I saw another picture of you enlarged in a Louisville photographer's window. I bought it. It is in my office now, my private office in Chicago. You are standing by a mantelpiece. I remember, replied Bernice, moved but uncertain. Let me tell you a little something about my life, will you? It won't take long. I was born in Philadelphia. My family had always belonged there. I have been in the banking and street railway business all my life. My first wife was a Presbyterian girl, religious, conventional. She was older than I by 6 or 7 years. I was happy for a while, 5 or 6 years. We had 2 children, both still living. Then I met my present wife. She was younger than myself, at least 10 years, and very good-looking. She was in some respects more intelligent than my first wife. At least less conventional, more generous, I thought. I fell in love with her, and when I eventually left Philadelphia I got a divorce and married her. I was greatly in love with her at the time. I thought she was an ideal mate for me, and I still think she has many qualities which make her attractive. But my own ideals in regard to women have all the time been slowly changing. I've come to see, through various experiments, that she is not the ideal woman for me at all. She does not understand me. I don't pretend to understand myself, but it has occurred to me that there might be a woman somewhere who would understand me better than I understand myself, who would see the things that I don't see about myself and would like me anyhow. I might as well tell you that I have been a lover of women always. There is just one ideal thing in this world to me, and that is the woman that I would like to have. I should think it would make it rather difficult for any one woman to discover just which woman you would like to have, smiled Bernice whimsically. Cowperwood was unabashed. It would, I presume, unless she should chance to be the very one woman I am talking about, he replied impressively. I should think she would have her work cut out for her, under any circumstances, added Bernice lightly, but with a touch of sympathy in her voice. I'm making a confession, replied Cowperwood seriously and a little heavily. I'm not apologizing for myself. The women I have known would make ideal wives for some men, but not for me. Life has taught me that much. It has changed me. And do you think the process has stopped by any means? She replied quaintly, with that air of superior banter which puzzled, fascinated, defied him. No, I will not say that. My ideal has become fixed, though, apparently. I have had it for a number of years now. It spoils other matters for me. There is such a thing as an ideal. We do have a pole star in physics. As he said this, Cowperwood realized that for him he was making a very remarkable confession. He had come here primarily to magnetize her and control her judgment. As a matter of fact, it was almost the other way about. She was almost dominating him. Lithe, slender, resourceful, histrionic, she was standing before him, making him explain himself. Only he did not see her so much in that light as in the way of a large, kindly, mothering intelligence, which could see, feel, and understand. She would know how it was, he felt sure. He could make himself understood if he tried. Whatever he was or had been, she would not take a petty view. She could not. Her answers thus far guaranteed as much. Yes, she replied, we do have a pole star, but you do not seem able to find it. Do you expect to find your ideal in any living woman? I have found it, he answered, wondering at the ingenuity and complexity of her mind. and of his own, for that matter. Of all mind, indeed. Deep below deep it lay, staggering him at times by its fathomless reaches. I hope you will take seriously what I am going to say, for it will explain so much. When I began to be interested in your picture, I was so because it coincided with the ideal I had in mind, the thing that you think changes swiftly. That was nearly 7 years ago. Since then it has never changed. When I saw you at your school on Riverside Drive, I was fully convinced. Although I have said nothing, I have remained so. Perhaps you think I had no right to any such feelings. Most people would agree with you. I had them, and I do have them just the same, and it explains my relation to your mother. When she came to me once in Louisville and told me of her difficulties, I was glad to help her for your sake. That has been my reason ever since, although she does not know that. In some respects, Bernice, your mother is a little dull. All this while I have been in love with you, intensely so. As you stand there now, you seem to me amazingly beautiful, the ideal I have been telling you about. Don't be disturbed, I shan't press any attentions on you. Bernice had moved very slightly. She was concerned as much for him as for herself. His power was so wide, his power so great. She could not help taking him seriously when he was so serious. I have done whatever I have done in connection with you and your mother because I have been in love with you, and because I wanted you to become the splendid thing I thought you ought to become. You have not known it, but you are the cause of my building the house on Fifth Avenue, the principal reason. I wanted to build something worthy of you. A dream? Certainly. Everything we do seems to have something of that quality. Its beauty, if there is any, is due to you. I made it beautiful thinking of you. He paused, and Bernice gave no sign. Her first impulse had been to object, but her vanity, her love of art, her love of power, all were touched. At the same time, she was curious, now, as to whether he had merely expected to take her as his mistress, or to wait until she could honor him as his wife. "I suppose you are wondering whether I ever expected to marry you or not," he went on, getting the thought out of her mind. "I'm no different from many men in that respect, Bernice. I will be frank. I wanted you in any way that I could get you. I was living in the hope all along that you would fall in love with me, as I had with you. I hated Braxmar here not long ago when he appeared on the scene, but I could never have thought of interfering. I was quite prepared to give you up. I've envied every man I've ever seen you with, young and old. I've even envied your mother for being so close to you when I could not be. At the same time, I've wanted you to have everything that would help you in any way. I did not want to interfere with you in case you found someone whom you could truly love, if I knew that you could not love me. There is the whole story outside of anything you may know. But it is not because of this that I came today. Not to tell you this." He paused, as if expecting her to say something, though she made no comment beyond a questioning, "Yes?" "The thing that I have come to say is that I want you to go on as you were before. Whatever you may think of me, or of what I have just told you, I want you to believe that I am sincere and disinterested in what I am telling you now. My dream in connection with you is not quite over. Chance might make me eligible if you should happen to care, but I want you to go on and be happy regardless of me. I have dreamed, but I dare say it has been a mistake. Hold your head high. You have a right to. Be a lady. Marry anyone you really love. I will see that you have a suitable marriage portion. I love you, Bernice, but I will make it a fatherly affection from now on. When I die, I will put you in my will. But go on now in the spirit you were going before. I really can't be happy unless I think you are going to be." He paused, still looking at her, believing for the time being what he said. If he should die, she would find herself in his will. If she were to go on and socialize and seek, she might find someone to love, but also she might think of him more kindly before she did so. What would be the cost of her as a ward, compared to his satisfaction and delight in having her at least friendly and sympathetic, and being in her good graces and confidence? Bernice, who had always been more or less interested in him, temperamentally biased, indeed, in his direction because of his efficiency, simplicity, directness, and force, was especially touched, in this instance, by his utter frankness and generosity. She might question his temperamental control over his own sincerity in the future, but she could scarcely question that at present he was sincere. Moreover, his long period of secret love and admiration, the thought of so powerful a man dreaming of her in this fashion was so flattering. It soothed her troubled vanity and shame in what had gone before. His straightforward confession had a kind of nobility which was electric, moving. She looked at him as he stood there, a little grey about the temples, the most appealing ornament of some men to some women, and for the life of her she could not help being moved by a kind of tenderness, sympathy, mothering affection. Obviously he did need the woman his attitude seemed to show that he needed, some woman of culture, spirit, taste, amorousness. Or at least he was entitled to dream of her. As he stood before her he seemed a kind of Superman, and yet also a bad boy, handsome, powerful, hopeful, not so very much older than herself now, impelled by some blazing internal force which harried him on and on. How much did he really care for her? How much could he? How much could he care for anyone? Yet see all he had done to interest her. What did that mean? To say all this, to do all this? Outside was his car, brown and radiant in the snow. He was the great Frank Algernon Cowperwood of Chicago, and he was pleading with her, a mere chit of a girl, to be kind to him, not to put him out of her life entirely. It touched her intellect, her pride, her fancy. Aloud she said, "I like you better now. I really believe in you. I never did quite before. Not that I think I ought to let you spend your money on me or Mother, I don't. But I admire you. You make me. I understand how it is, I think. I know what your ambitions are. I've always felt that I did in part. But you mustn't talk to me any more now. I want to think. I want to think over what you have said. I don't know whether I can bring myself to it or not." She noticed that his eyes seemed to move somehow in their deepest depths again. "But we won't talk about it any more at present. But, Bernice," he added, with a real plea in his voice, "I wonder if you do understand. I've been so lonely. I am—" "Yes, I do," she replied, holding out her hand. "We are going to be friends, whatever happens from now on, because I really like you. You mustn't ask me to decide about the other, though, today. I can't do it. I don't want to. I don't care to." "Not when I would so gladly give you everything. When I need it so little." "Not until I think it out for myself. I don't think so, though. No," she replied with an air. "There, Mr. Guardian Father." She laughed, pushing his hand away. Cowperwood's heart bounded. He would have given millions to take her close in his arms. As it was, he smiled appealingly. "Don't you want to jump in and come to New York with me? If your mother isn't at the apartment, you could stop at the Netherland." "No, not today. I expect to be in soon. I will let you know, or Mother will." He bustled out and into the machine after a moment of parley, waving to her over the purpling snow of the evening as his machine tore eastward, planning to make New York by dinner-time. If he could just keep her in this friendly, sympathetic attitude. If he only could. Chapter 54. Wanted. 50-year franchises. Whatever his momentary satisfaction in her friendly acceptance of his confession, the uncertain attitude of Bernice left Cowperwood about where he was before. By a strange stroke of fate, Braxmar, his young rival, had been eliminated, and Bernice had been made to see him, Cowperwood, in his true colours of love and of service for her. Yet plainly she did not accept them at his own valuation. More than ever was he conscious of the fact that he had fallen in tow of an amazing individual, one who saw life from a distinct and peculiar point of view, and who was not to be bent to his will. That fact, more than anything else, for her grace and beauty merely emblazoned it, caused him to fall into a helpless infatuation. He said to himself over and over, "Well, I can live without her if I must." But at this stage, the mere thought was an actual stab in his vitals. What, after all, was life, wealth, fame, if you couldn't have the woman you wanted? Love, that indefinable, unnameable coddling of the spirit which the strongest, almost more than the weakest, crave. At last he saw clearly, as within a chalice-like nimbus, that the ultimate end of fame, power, vigor, was beauty, and that beauty was a compound of the taste, the emotion, the innate culture, passion, and dreams of a woman like Bernice Fleming. That was it. That was it. And beyond was nothing save crumbling age, darkness, silence. In the meantime, owing to the preliminary activity and tact of his agents and advisers, the Sunday newspapers were vying with one another in describing the wonders of his new house in New York, its cost, the value of its ground, the wealthy citizens with whom the Cowperwoods would now be neighbors. There were double-column pictures of Aileen and Cowperwood, with articles indicating them as prospective entertainers on a grand scale, who would unquestionably be received because of their tremendous wealth. As a matter of fact, this was purely newspaper gossip and speculation. While the general columns made news and capital of his wealth, special society columns, which dealt with the ultra-fashionable, ignored him entirely. Already the machination of certain Chicago social figures in distributing information as to his past was discernible in the attitude of those clubs, organizations, and even churches, membership in which constitutes a form of social passport to better and higher earthly, if not spiritual, realms. His emissaries were active enough, but soon found that their end was not to be gained in a day. Many were waiting locally, anxious enough to get in, and with social equipments which the Cowperwoods could scarcely boast. After being blackballed by one or two exclusive clubs, seeing his application for a pew at St. Thomas's quietly pigeonholed for the present, and his invitations declined by several multimillionaires, whom he met in the course of commercial transactions, he began to feel that his splendid home, aside from its final purpose as an art museum, could be of little value. At the same time, Cowperwood's financial genius was constantly being rewarded by many new phases of materiality, chiefly by an offensive and defensive alliance he was now able to engineer between himself and the house of Heckelheimer, Gottlieb & Co. Seeing the iron manner in which he had managed to wrest victory out of defeat after the first seriously contested election, these gentlemen had experienced a change of heart, and announced that they would now gladly help finance any new enterprise which Cowperwood might undertake. Among many other financiers, they had heard of his triumph in connection with the failure of American Match. "Dot must be a right clever man, dot Cowperwood," Mr. Gottlieb told several of his partners, rubbing his hands and smiling. "I should like to meet him." And so Cowperwood was maneuvered into the giant banking office where Mr. Gottlieb extended a genial hand. "I hear much of Chicago," he explained in his semi-German, semi-Hebraic dialect, "but almost more of you. Are you going to swallow up all the street railways and elevated roads out there?" Cowperwood smiled his most ingenious smile. "Why, would you like me to leave a few for you?" "Not that exactly, but I might not mind sharing in some of them with you." "You can join with me any time, Mr. Gottlieb, as you must know. The door is always very, very wide open for you." "I must look into that some more. It looks very promising to me. I am glad to meet you." The great external element in Cowperwood's financial success, and one which he himself had foreseen from the very beginning, was the fact that Chicago was developing constantly. What had been when he arrived a soggy, messy plain strewn with shanties, ragged sidewalks, a higgledy-piggledy business heart, was now truly an astounding metropolis, which had passed the million mark in population, and which stretched proud and strong over the greater part of Cook County. Where once had been a meager, makeshift financial section, with here and there only a splendid business building, or hotel, or a public office of some kind, there were now canyon-like streets, lined with 15 and even 18-story office buildings, from the upper stories of which, as from watchtowers, might be surveyed the vast, expanding regions of simple home life below. Farther out were districts of mansions, parks, pleasure resorts, great worlds of train yards and manufacturing areas. In the commercial heart of this world, Frank Algernon Cowperwood had truly become a figure of giant significance. How wonderful it is that men grow until, like colossi, they bestride the world, or like banyan trees, they drop roots from every branch and are themselves a forest. a forest of intricate commercial life, of which 1,000 material aspects are the evidence. His street railway properties were like a net, the parasite gold thread, linked together as they were, and draining 2 or 3 important sides of the city. In 1886, when he had first secured a foothold, they had been capitalized at between 6 and 7 millions, every device for issuing $1 on real property having been exhausted. Today, under his management, they were capitalized at between 60 and 70 millions. The majority of the stock issued and sold was subject to a financial device, whereby 20% controlled 80%, Cowperwood holding that 20% and borrowing money on it as hypothecated collateral. In the case of the West Side Corporation, a corporate issue of over 30 millions had been made, and these stocks, owing to the tremendous carrying power of the roads and the swelling traffic night and morning of poor sheep who paid their hard-earned nickels, had a market value which gave the road an assured physical value of about 3 times the sum for which it could have been built. The North Chicago Company, which in 1886 had a physical value of little more than $1 million, could not now be duplicated for less than 7 millions, and was capitalized at nearly 15 millions. The road was valued at over $100,000 more per mile than the sum for which it could actually have been replaced. Pity the poor groveling hack at the bottom, who has not the brain power either to understand or to control that which his very presence and necessities create. These tremendous holdings, paying from 10 to 12% on every $100 share, were in the control, if not in the actual ownership, of Cowperwood. Millions in loans that did not appear on the books of the companies he had converted into actual cash, wherewith he had bought houses, lands, equipages, paintings, government bonds of the purest gold value, thereby assuring himself, to that extent, of a fortune vaulted and locked, absolutely secure. After much toiling and moiling on the part of his overworked legal department, he had secured a consolidation, under the title of the Consolidated Traction Company of Illinois, of all outlying lines, each having separate franchises and capitalized separately, yet operated by an amazing hocus-pocus of contracts and agreements in single, harmonious union with all his other properties. The North and West Chicago companies he now proposed to unite into a third company, to be called the Union Traction Company. By taking up the 10 and 12% issues of the old North and West companies and giving 2 for 1 of the new 6% $100 share Union Traction stocks in their stead, he could satisfy the current stockholders, who were apparently made somewhat better off thereby, and still create and leave for himself a handsome margin of nearly $80 million. With the renewal of his franchise for 20, 50, or 100 years, he would have fastened on the city of Chicago the burden of yielding interest on this somewhat fictitious value, and would leave himself personally worth in the neighborhood of 100 millions. This matter of extending his franchises was a most difficult and intricate business, however. It involved overcoming or outwitting a recent and very treacherous increase of local sentiment against him. This had been occasioned by various details which related to his elevated roads. To the 2 lines already built, he now added a third property, the Union Loop, which he prepared to connect not only with his own, but with other outside elevated properties, chief among which was Mr. Scrihart's South Side L. He would then farm out to his enemies the privilege of running trains on this new line. However unwillingly, they would be forced to avail themselves of the proffered opportunity, because within the region covered by the new loop was the true congestion. Here everyone desired to come either once or twice during the day or night. By this means Cowperwood would secure to his property a paying interest from the start. This scheme aroused a really unprecedented antagonism in the breasts of Cowperwood's enemies. By the Arneel, Hand, Scrihart contingent, it was looked upon as nothing short of diabolical. The newspapers, directed by such men as Haigden, Hyssop, Ormond, Ricketts, and Truman Leslie MacDonald, whose father was now dead, and whose thoughts as editor of the Enquirer were almost solely directed toward driving Cowperwood out of Chicago, began to shout, as a last resort, of the interests of democracy. Seats for everybody on Cowperwood's lines, no more straps in the rush hours, 3-cent fares for working men, morning and evening, Free transfers from all of Cowperwood's lines north to west and west to north, 20% of the gross income of his lines to be paid to the city. The masses should be made cognizant of their individual rights and privileges. Such a course, while decidedly inimical to Cowperwood's interests at the present time, and as such strongly favoured by the majority of his opponents, had nevertheless its disturbing elements to an ultra-conservative like Hosmer Hand. "I don't know about this, Norman," he remarked to Schryhart on one occasion. "I don't know about this. It's one thing to stir up the public, but it's another to make them forget. This is a restless, socialistic country, and Chicago is the very hotbed and center of it. Still, if it will serve to trip him up, I suppose it will do for the present. The newspapers can probably smooth it all over later, but I don't know." Mr. Hand was of that order of mind that sees socialism as a horrible importation of monarchy-ridden Europe. Why couldn't the people be satisfied to allow the strong, intelligent, God-fearing men of the community to arrange things for them? Wasn't that what democracy meant? Certainly it was. He himself was one of the strong. He could not help distrusting all this radical palaver. Still, anything to hurt Cowperwood. Anything. Cowperwood was not slow to realize that public sentiment was now in danger of being thoroughly crystallized against him by newspaper agitation. Although his franchises would not expire, the large majority of them, before January the 1st, 1903, yet if things went on at this rate, it would be doubtful soon whether ever again he would be able to win another election by methods legitimate or illegitimate. Hungry aldermen and councilmen might be venal and greedy enough to do anything he should ask, provided he was willing to pay enough, but even the thickest-hided, the most voracious and corrupt politician could scarcely withstand the searching glare of publicity and the infuriated rage of a possibly aroused public opinion. By degrees, this last, owing to the untiring efforts of the newspapers, was being whipped into a wild foam. To come into council at this time to ask for a 20-year extension of franchises not destined to expire for 7 years was too much. It could not be done. Even suborned councilmen would be unwilling to undertake it just now. There are some things which even politically are impossible. To make matters worse, the 20-year franchise limit was really not at all sufficient for his present needs. In order to bring about the consolidation of his north and west service lines, which he was now proposing, and on the strength of which he wished to issue at least $200 million worth of $100 6% shares, in place of the $70 million current of 10 and 12%, it was necessary for him to secure a much more respectable term of years than the brief one now permitted by the state legislature, even providing that this latter could be obtained. "People are not very much interested in these short-term franchises," observed Mr. Gottlieb once when Cowperwood was talking the matter over with him. He wanted Heckelheimer and Co. to underwrite the whole issue. "They are so insecure. Now, if you could get, say, a franchise for 50 or 100 years, or something like that, your stocks would go off like hot cakes. I know where I could dispose of $50 million of them in Germany alone." He was most unctuous and pleading. Cowperwood understood this quite as well as Gottlieb, if not better. He was not at all satisfied with the thought of obtaining a beggarly 20-year extension for his giant schemes, when cities like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and Pittsburgh were apparently glad to grant their corporations franchises which would not expire for 99 years at the earliest, and in most cases were given in perpetuity. This was the kind of franchise favored by the great moneyed houses of New York and Europe, and which Gottlieb and even Addison locally were demanding. "It is certainly important that we get these franchises renewed for 50 years, Addison used to say to him, and it was seriously and disagreeably true. The various lights of Cowperwood's legal department, constantly on the search for new legislative devices, were not slow to grasp the import of the situation. It was not long before the resourceful Mr. Joel Avery appeared with a suggestion. "Did you notice what the state legislature of New York is doing in connection with the various local transit problems down there?" asked this honorable gentleman of Cowperwood one morning, ambling in when announced and seating himself in the great presence. A half-burned cigar was between his fingers, and a little round felt hat looked peculiarly rakish above his sinister, intellectual, constructive face and eyes. "No, I didn't," replied Cowperwood, who had actually noted and pondered upon the item in question, but who did not care to say so. "I saw something about it, but I didn't pay much attention to it. What of it?" "Well, it plans to authorize a body of 4 or 5 men, one branch in New York, one in Buffalo, I presume, to grant all new franchises and extend old ones, with the consent of the various local communities involved. They are to fix the rate of compensation to be paid to the state or the city, and the rates of fare. They can regulate transfers, stock issues, and all that sort of thing. I was thinking, if at any time we find this business of renewing the franchises too uncertain here, we might go into the state legislature and seek what can be done about introducing a public service commission of that kind into this state. We're not the only corporation that would welcome it. Of course, it would be better if there were a general or special demand for it outside of ourselves. It ought not to originate with us." He stared at Cowperwood heavily, the latter returning a reflective gaze. "I'll think it over," he said. "There may be something in that." Henceforth, the thought of instituting such a commission never left Cowperwood's mind. It contained the germ of a solution, the possibility of extending his franchises for 50 or even 100 years. This plan, as Cowperwood was subsequently to discover, was the thing more or less expressly forbidden by the state constitution of Illinois. The latter provided that no special or exclusive privilege, immunity, or franchise whatsoever should be granted to any corporation, association, or individual. Yet, what is a little matter like the Constitution between friends, anyhow? Someone had already asked. There are fads in legislation as well as dusty pigeonholes in which phases of older law are tucked away and forgotten. Many earlier ideals of the Constitution makers had long since been conveniently obscured or nullified by decisions, appeals to the federal government, appeals to the state government, communal contracts, and the like. Fine, cobwebby figments, all, but sufficient, just the same, to render inoperative the original intention. Besides, Cowperwood had but small respect for either the intelligence or the self-protective capacity of such men as constituted the rural voting element of the state. From his lawyers and from others he had heard innumerable droll stories of life in the state legislature, and the state counties and towns, on the bench, at the rural huskings where the state elections were won, in country hotels, on country roads and farms. One day as I was getting on the train at Patunky, old General Van Sickle or Judge Dickensheets or ex-Judge Avery would begin, and then would follow some amazing narration of rural immorality or dullness, or political or social misconception. Of the total population of the in control, for the remaining million, divided between 12 small cities and an agricultural population, he had small respect. What did this handful of yokels amount to, anyhow? Dull, frivoling, barn-dancing bores. The great state of Illinois, a territory as large as England proper, and as fertile as Egypt, bordered by a great lake and a vast river, and with a population of over 2 million free-born Americans, would scarcely seem a fit subject for corporate manipulation and control, yet a more trade-ridden commonwealth might not have been found anywhere at this time within the entire length and breadth of the universe. Cowperwood personally, though contemptuous of the bucolic mass when regarded as individuals, had always been impressed by this great community of his election. Here had come Marquette and Joliet, La Salle and Hennepin, dreaming away to the Pacific. Here Lincoln and Douglas, antagonist and pro-antagonist of slavery argument, had contested. Here had arisen Joe Smith, propagator of that strange American dogma of the Latter-day Saints. What a state, Cowperwood sometimes thought. What a figment of the brain. And yet, how wonderful. He had crossed it often on his way to St. Louis, to Memphis, to Denver, and had been touched by its very simplicity. The small, new wooden towns, so redolent of American tradition, prejudice, force, and illusion. The white-steepled church, the lawn-faced, tree-shaded village streets, the long stretches of flat, open country where corn grew in serried rows, or where in winter the snow bedded lightly. It all reminded him a little of his own father and mother, who had been in many respects suited to such a world as this. Yet none the less did he hesitate to press on the measure which was to adjust his own future, to make profitable his own issue of $200 million worth of Union traction, to secure him a fixed place in the financial oligarchy of America and of the world. The state legislature at this time was ruled over by a small group of wire-pulling, pettifogging corporation-controlled individuals, who came up from the respective towns, counties, and cities of the state, but who bore the same relation to the communities which they represented, and to their superiors and equals in and out of the legislative halls at Springfield, that men do to such allies anywhere in any given field. Why do we call them pettifogging and dismiss them? Perhaps they were pettifogging, but certainly no more so than any other shrewd rat or animal that burrows its way onward, and shall we say upward? The deepest controlling principle which animated these individuals was the oldest and first, that of self-preservation. Picture, for example, a common occurrence, that of Senator John H. Southwark, conversing with perhaps Senator George Mason Wade of Gallatin County, behind a legislative door in one of the Senate conference chambers, toward the close of a session. Senator Southwark, blinking, buttonholing his well-dressed colleague, and drawing very near. Senator Wade, curious, confidential, expectant. A genial, solid, experienced, slightly paunchy, but well-built Senator Wade, and handsome, too. "You know, George, I told you there would be something eventually in the Quincy waterfront improvement if it ever worked out. Well, here it is. Ed Truesdale was in town yesterday." This with a knowing eye, as much as to say, mum's the word. "Here's 500. Count it." A quick flashing out of some green and yellow bills from a vest pocket, a light thumbing and counting on the part of Senator Wade, a flare of comprehension, approval, gratitude, admiration, as though to signify, "This is something like. Thanks, John. I'd pretty near forgot all about it. Nice people, eh? If you see Ed again, give him my regards. When that Belleville contest comes up, let me know." Mr. Wade, being a good speaker, was frequently in request to stir up the populace to a sense of pro or con in connection with some legislative crisis impending, and it was to some such future opportunity that he now pleasantly referred. Oh, life, oh, politics, oh, necessity, oh, hunger, oh, burning human appetite and desire on every hand. Mr. Southwark was an unobtrusive, pleasant, quiet man, of the type that would usually be patronized as rural and pettifogging by men high in commercial affairs. He was none the less well fitted to his task, a capable and diligent beneficiary and agent. He was well-dressed, middle-aged, only 45, cool, courageous, genial, with eyes that were material but not cold or hard, and a light, springy, energetic step and manner, a holder of some C.W. and I.R.R. shares, a director of one of his local county banks, a silent partner in the Effingham Herald. He was a personage in his district, one much revered by local swains. Yet a more game and rascally type was not to be found in all rural legislation. It was old General Van Sickle who sought out Southwark, having remembered him from his earlier legislative days, and it was Avery who conducted the negotiations. Primarily in all-state scheming at Springfield, Senator Southwark was supposed to represent the CWI, one of the great truck lines traversing the state, and incidentally connecting Chicago with the south, west, and east. This road, having a large local mileage and being anxious to extend its franchises in Chicago and elsewhere, was deep in state politics. By a curious coincidence, it was mainly financed by Heckelheimer Gottlieb & Co. of New York, though Cowperwood's connection with that concern was not as yet known. Going to Southwark, who was the Republican whip in the Senate, Avery proposed that he, in conjunction with Judge Dickensheets and one Gibson Bickle, counsel for the CWI, should now undertake to secure sufficient support in the state Senate and House for a scheme introducing the New York idea of a public service commission into the governing machinery of the state of Illinois. This measure, be it noted, was to be supplemented by one very interesting and important little proviso, to the effect that all franchise-holding corporations should hereby, for a period of 50 years from the date of the enactment of the bill into law, be assured of all their rights, privileges, and immunities, including franchises, of course. This was justified on the ground that any such radical change as that involved in the introduction of a public service commission might disturb the peace and well-being of corporations with franchises which still had years to run. Senator Southwark saw nothing very wrong with this idea, though he naturally perceived what it was all about, and whom it was truly designed to protect. "Yes," he said succinctly, "I see the lay of the land, but what do I get out of it? $50,000 for yourself if it's successful, $10,000 if it isn't, provided you make an honest effort, $2,000 apiece for any of the boys who see fit to help you if we win. Is that perfectly satisfactory?" "Perfectly," replied Senator Southwark. Chapter 55. Cowperwood and the Governor. A Public Service Commission law might ipso facto have been quietly passed at this session if the arbitrary franchise-extending proviso had not been introduced, and this on the thin excuse that so novel a change in the working scheme of the state government might bring about hardship to some. This redounded too obviously to the benefit of one particular corporation. The newspaper men, as thick as flies about the hall of the state capitol at Springfield, and essentially watchful and loyal to their papers, were quick to sense the true state of affairs. Never were there such hawks as newspaper men. These wretches, employed by snivelling, mud-snouting newspapers of the opposition, were not only in the councils of politicians, in the pay of rival corporations, in the confidence of the governor, in the secrets of the senators and local representatives, but were here and there in one another's confidence. A piece of news, a rumor, a dream, a fancy, whispered by Senator Smith to Senator Jones, or by Representative Smith to Representative Jones, and confided by him in turn to Charlie White of the Globe or Eddie Burns of the Democrat, would in turn be communicated to Robert Hazlitt of the Press, or Harry Emmons of the Transcript. All at once, a disturbing announcement in one or other of the papers, no one knowing whence it came. Neither Senator Smith nor Senator Jones had told anyone. No word of the confidence imposed in Charlie White or Eddie Burns had ever been breathed. But there you were. The thing was in the papers. The storm of inquiry, opinion, opposition was on. No one knew, no one was to blame, but it was on, and the battle had henceforth to be fought in the open. Consider also the governor, who presided at this time in the executive chamber at Springfield. He was a strange, tall, dark, osseous man, who, owing to the brooding, melancholy character of his own disposition, had a checkered and somewhat sad career behind him. Born in Sweden, he had been brought to America as a child and allowed or compelled to fight his own way upward under all the grinding aspects of poverty. Owing to an energetic and indomitable temperament, he had, through years of law practice and public labors of various kinds, built up for himself a following among Chicago Swedes which amounted to adoration. He had been city tax collector, city surveyor, district attorney, and for 6 or 8 years a state circuit judge. In all these capacities he had manifested a tendency to do the right, as he saw it, and play fair, qualities which endeared him to the idealistic. Honest, and with a hopeless, brooding sympathy for the miseries of the poor, he had, as circuit judge and also as district attorney, rendered various decisions which had made him very unpopular with the rich and powerful, decisions in damage cases, fraud cases, railroad claim cases, where the city or the state was seeking to oust various powerful railway corporations from possession of property, yards, water frontages, and the like, to which they had no just claim. At the same time the populace, reading the news items of his doings and hearing him speak on various and sundry occasions, conceived a great fancy for him. He was primarily soft-hearted, sweet-minded, fiery, a brilliant orator, a dynamic presence. In addition, he was woman-hungry, a phase which homely, sex-starved intellectuals the world over will understand, to the shame of a lying age, that because of quixotic dogma belies its greatest desire, its greatest sorrow, its greatest joy. All these factors turned an ultra-conservative element in the community against him, and he was considered dangerous. At the same time, he had, by careful economy and investment, built up a fair-sized fortune. Recently, however, owing to the craze for skyscrapers, he had placed much of his holdings in a somewhat poorly constructed, and therefore unprofitable office building. Because of this error, financial wreck was threatening him. Even now he was knocking at the doors of large bonding companies for assistance. This man, in company with the antagonistic financial element and the newspapers, constituted, as regards Cowperwood's Public Service Commission scheme, a triumvirate of difficulties not easy to overcome. The newspapers, in due time catching wind of the true purport of the plan, ran screaming to their readers with the horrible intelligence. In the offices of Schryhart, Arneel, Hand, and Merrill, as well as in other centres of finance, there was considerable puzzling over the situation, and then a shrewd, intelligent deduction was made. "Do you see what he's up to, Hosmer?" inquired Schryhart of Hand. "He sees that we have him scotched here in Chicago. As things stand now, he can't go into the city council and ask for a franchise for more than 20 years under the state law, and he can't do that for 3 or 4 years yet anyhow. His franchises don't expire soon enough. He knows that by the time they do expire, we will have public sentiment aroused to such a point that no council, however crooked it may be, will dare to give him what he asks, unless he is willing to make a heavy return to the city. If he does that, it will end his scheme of selling any $200 million of Union traction at 6%. The market won't back him up. He can't pay 20% to the city and give universal transfers, and pay 6% on $200 million, and everybody knows it. He has a fine scheme of making a cool $100 million out of this. Well, he can't do it. We must get the newspapers to hammer this legislative scheme of his to death. When he comes into the local council, he must pay 20 or 30% of the gross receipts of his road to the city. He must give free transfers from every one of his lines to every other one. Then we have him. I dislike to see socialistic ideas fostered, but it can't be helped. We have to do it. If we ever get him out of here, we can hush up the newspapers and the public will forget about it. At least we can hope so." In the meantime, the governor had heard the whisper of boodle, a word of the day expressive of a corrupt legislative fund. Not at all a small-minded man, nor involved in the financial campaign being waged against Cowperwood, nor inclined to be influenced mentally or emotionally by superheated charges against the latter, he nevertheless speculated deeply. In a vague way he sensed the dreams of Cowperwood. The charge of seducing women so frequently made against the street railway magnate, so shocking to the yokel conventionalists, did not disturb him at all. Back of the onward sweep of the generations he himself sensed the mystic Aphrodite and her magic. He realized that Cowperwood had travelled fast, that he was pressing to the utmost a great advantage in the face of great obstacles. At the same time he knew that the present streetcar service of Chicago was by no means bad. Would he be proving unfaithful to the trust imposed on him by the great electorate of Illinois if he were to advantage Cowperwood's cause? Must he not rather, in the sight of all men, smoke out the animating causes here, greed, overweening ambition, colossal self-interest, as opposed to the selflessness of a Christian ideal and of a democratic theory of government? Life rises to a high plane of the dramatic, and hence of the artistic, whenever and wherever in the conflict regarding material possession there enters a conception of the ideal. It was this that lit forever the beacon fires of Troy, that thundered eternally in the horses' hooves at Arbela, and in the guns at Waterloo. Ideals were here at stake, the dreams of one man as opposed, perhaps, to the ultimate dreams of a city, or state, or nation, the grovellings and wallowings of a democracy slowly, blindly trying to stagger to its feet. In this conflict, taking place in an inland cottage-dotted state where men were clowns and churls, dancing fiddlers at country fairs, were opposed, as the governor saw it, the ideals of one man and the ideals of men. Governor Swanson decided, after mature deliberation, to veto the bill. Cowperwood, debonair as ever, faithful as ever to his logic and his conception of individuality, was determined that no stone should be left unturned that would permit him to triumph, that would carry him finally to the gorgeous throne of his own construction. Having first engineered the matter through the legislature by a tortuous process, fired upon at every step by the press, he next sent various individuals, state legislatures, representatives of the CW&I, members of outside corporations, to see the governor. But Swanson was adamant. He did not see how he could conscientiously sanction the bill. Finally, one day, as he was seated in his Chicago business office, a fateful chamber located in the troublesome building which was subsequently to wreck his fortune, and which was the raison d'etre of his present period of care and depression, enter the smug, comfortable presence of Judge Nahum Dickensheets, at present senior counsel of the North Chicago Street Railway. He was a very mountain of a man physically, smooth-faced, agreeably clothed, hard, and yet ingratiating of eye, a thinker, a reasoner. Swanson knew much of him by reputation and otherwise, although personally they were no more than speaking acquaintances. "How are you, Governor? I'm glad to see you again. I heard you were back in Chicago. I see by the morning papers that you have that Southwark Public Service Bill up before you. I thought I would come over and have a few words with you about it, if you have no objection. I've been trying to get down to Springfield for the last 3 weeks to have a little chat with you before you reached a conclusion one way or the other. Do you mind if I inquire whether you have decided to veto it?" The ex-judge, faintly perfumed, clean, and agreeable, carried in his hand a large-sized black hand satchel, which he put down beside him on the floor. "Yes, Judge," replied Swanson. "I've practically decided to veto it. I can see no practical reason for supporting it. As I look at it now, it's specious and special, not particularly called for or necessary at this time." The governor talked with a slight Swedish accent, intellectual, individual. A long, placid, philosophic discussion of all the pros and cons of the situation followed. The governor was tired, distrait, but ready to listen in a tolerant way to more argument along the line with which he was already fully familiar. He knew, of course, that Dickensheets was counsel for the North Chicago Street Railway Company. "I'm very glad to have heard what you have to say, Judge," finally commented the governor. "I don't want you to think I haven't given this matter serious thought. I have. I know most of the things that have been done down at Springfield. Mr. Cowperwood is an able man. I don't charge any more against him than I do against 20 other agencies that are operating down there at this very moment. I know what his difficulties are. I can hardly be accused of sympathizing with his enemies, for they certainly do not sympathize with me. I am not even listening to the newspapers. This is a matter of faith in democracy, a difference in ideals between myself and many other men. I haven't vetoed the bill yet. I don't say that something may not arise to make me sign it. My present intention, unless I hear something much more favorable in its behalf than I have already heard, is to veto it." "Governor," said Dickensheets, rising, "let me thank you for your courtesy. I would be the last person in the world to wish to influence you outside the line of your private convictions and your personal sense of fair play. At the same time, I have tried to make plain to you how essential it is, how only fair and right that this local street railway franchise business should be removed out of the realm of sentiment, emotion, public passion, envy, bunkum, and all the other influences that are at work to frustrate and make difficult the work of Mr. Cowperwood. All envy, I tell you. His enemies are willing to sacrifice every principle of justice and fair play to see him eliminated. That sums it up." "That may all be true," replied Swanson. "Just the same, there is another principle involved here, which you do not seem to see or do not care to consider, the right of the people under the state constitution to a consideration, a revaluation of their contracts at the time and in the manner agreed upon under the original franchise. What you propose is sumptuary legislation. It makes null and void an agreement between the people and the street railway companies, at a time when the people have a right to expect a full and free consideration of this matter, aside from state legislative influence and control. To persuade the state legislature by influence or by any other means to step in at this time and interfere is unfair. The propositions involved in those bills should be referred to the people at the next election for approval or not, just as they see fit. That is the way this matter should be arranged. It will not do to come into the legislature and influence or buy votes, and then expect me to write my signature under the whole matter as satisfactory." Swanson was not heated or antipathetic. He was cool, firm, well-intentioned. Dickensheets passed his hand over a wide, high temple. He seemed to be meditating something, some hitherto untried statement or course of action. "Well, Governor," he repeated, "I want to thank you anyhow. You have been exceedingly kind. By the way, I see you have a large, roomy safe here." He had picked up the bag he was carrying. "I wonder if I might leave this here for a day or two in your care. It contains some papers that I do not wish to carry into the country with me. Would you mind locking it up in your safe and letting me have it when I send for it?" "With pleasure," replied the governor. He took it, placed it in lower storage space, and closed and locked the door. The two men parted with a genial handshake. The governor returned to his meditations. The judge hurried to catch a car. About 11 o'clock the next morning, Swanson was still working in his office, worrying greatly over some method whereby he could raise $100,000 to defray interest charges, repairs, and other payments on a structure that was by no means meeting expenses, and was hence a drain. At this juncture his office door opened, and his very youthful office boy presented him the card of F.A. Cowperwood. The governor had never seen him before. Cowperwood entered, brisk, fresh, forceful. He was as crisp as a new dollar bill, as clean, sharp, firmly limbed. "Governor Swanson, I believe." "Yes, sir." The two were scrutinizing each other defensively. "I'm Mr. Cowperwood. I come to have a very few words with you. I will take very little of your time. I do not wish to go over any of the arguments that have been gone over before. I'm satisfied that you know all about them." "Yes. I had a talk with Judge Dickensheets yesterday." "Just so, Governor. Knowing all that you do, permit me to put one more matter before you. I know that you are comparatively a poor man, that every dollar you have is at present practically tied in this building. I know of two places where you have applied for a loan of $100,000 and have been refused because you haven't sufficient security to offer outside of this building, which is mortgaged up to its limit as it stands. The men, as you must know, who are fighting you are fighting me. I am a scoundrel because I am selfish and ambitious, a materialist. You are not a scoundrel, but a dangerous person, because you are an idealist. Whether you veto this bill or not, you will never again be elected governor of Illinois if the people who are fighting me succeed, as they will succeed, in fighting you." Swanson's dark eyes burned illuminatively. He nodded his head in assent. "Governor, I've come here this morning to bribe you if I can. I do not agree with your ideals. In the last analysis, I do not believe that they will work. I am sure I do not believe in most of the things that you believe in. Life is different at bottom, perhaps, from what either you or I may think. Just the same, as compared with other men, I sympathize with you. I will loan you that $100,000, and $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 more besides, if you wish. You need never pay me a dollar, or you can, if you wish, suit yourself. In that black bag that Judge Dickensheets brought here yesterday, and which is in your safe, is $300,000 in cash. He did not have the courage to mention it. Sign the bill, and let me beat the men who are trying to beat me. I will support you in the future with any amount of money or influence that I can bring to bear in any political contest you may choose to enter, state or national." Cowperwood's eyes glowed like a large, genial collie's. There was a suggestion of sympathetic appeal in them, rich and deep, and even more than that, a philosophic perception of ineffable things. Swanson arose. "You really don't mean to say that you are trying to bribe me openly, do you?" he inquired. In spite of a conventional impulse to burst forth in moralistic denunciation, solemnly phrased, he was compelled for the moment to see the other man's viewpoint. They were working in different directions, going different ways. To what ultimate end? "Mr. Cowperwood," continued the governor, his face a physiognomy out of Goya, his eye alight with a kind of understanding sympathy, "I suppose I ought to resent this, but I can't. I see your point of view. I'm sorry, but I can't help you, nor myself. My political belief, my ideals, compel me to veto this bill. When I forsake these, I am done politically with myself. I may not be elected governor again, but that does not matter either. I could use your money, but I won't. I shall have to bid you good morning." He moved toward the safe, slowly opened it, took out the bag, and brought it over. "You must take that with you," he added. The two men looked at each other a moment curiously, sadly, the one with a burden of financial, political, and moral worry on his spirit, the other with an unconquerable determination not to be worsted even in defeat. "Governor," concluded Cowperwood, in the most genial, contented, undisturbed voice, "you will live to see another legislature pass, and another governor sign some such bill. It will not be done this session, apparently, but it will be done. I'm not through, because my case is right and fair. Just the same, after you have vetoed the bill, come and see me, and I will loan you that $100,000 if you want it." Cowperwood went out. Swanson vetoed the bill. It is on record that subsequently he borrowed $100,000 from Cowperwood to stay him from ruin. Chapter 56. The Ordeal of Bernice. At the news that Swanson had refused to sign the bill, and that the legislature lacked sufficient courage to pass it over his veto, both Schryhart and Hand literally rubbed their hands in comfortable satisfaction. "Well, Hosmer," said Schryhart the next day when they met at their favorite club, the Union League, "it looks as though we were making some little progress after all, doesn't it? Our friend didn't succeed in turning that little trick, did he?" He beamed almost ecstatically upon his solid companion. "Not this time. I wonder what move he will decide to make next. I don't see very well what it can be. He knows now that he can't get his franchises without a compromise that will eat into his profits, and if that happens he can't sell his Union traction stock. This legislative scheme of his must have cost him all of $300,000, and what is he to show for it? The new legislature, unless I'm greatly mistaken, will be afraid to touch anything in connection with him. It's hardly likely that any of the Springfield politicians will want to draw the fire of the newspapers again." Schryhart felt very powerful, imposing, sleek, indeed, now that his theory of newspaper publicity as a cure was apparently beginning to work. Hand, more saturnine, more responsive to the uncertainty of things mundane, the shifty undercurrents that are perpetually sapping and mining below, was agreeable but not sure. Perhaps so. In regard to his Eastern life during this interlude, Cowperwood had become more and more keenly alive to the futility of the attempt to effect a social rescue for Aileen. What was the use, he often asked himself, as he contemplated her movements, thoughts, plans, as contrasted with the natural efficiency, taste, grace, and subtlety of a woman like Bernice. He felt that the latter could, if she would, smooth over in an adroit way all the silly social antagonisms which were now afflicting him. It was a woman's game, he frequently told himself, and would never be adjusted till he had the woman. Simultaneously, Aileen, looking at the situation from her own point of view, and nonplussed by the ineffectiveness of mere wealth, when not combined with a certain social something, which she did not appear to have, was nevertheless unwilling to surrender her dream. What was it, she asked herself over and over, that made this great difference between women and women? The question contained its own answer, but she did not know that. She was still good-looking, very, and an adept in self-ornamentation after her manner and taste. So great had been the newspaper palaver regarding the arrival of a new multimillionaire from the West, and the palace he was erecting, that even tradesmen, clerks, and hall-boys knew of her. Almost invariably, when called upon to state her name in such quarters, she was greeted by a slight start of recognition, a swift glance of examination, whispers, even open comment. That was something. Yet how much more and how different were those rarefied reaches of social supremacy to which popular repute bears scarcely any relationship at all. How different indeed. From what Cowperwood had said in Chicago, she had fancied that when they took up their formal abode in New York, he would make an attempt to straighten out his life somewhat, to modify the number of his indifferent amours, and to present an illusion of solidarity and unity. Yet now that they had actually arrived, she noticed that he was more concerned with his heightened political and financial complications in Illinois, and with his art collection, than he was with what might happen to be going on in the new home, or what could be made to happen there. As in the days of old, she was constantly puzzled by his persistent evenings out and his sudden appearances and disappearances. Yet, determine as she might, rage secretly or openly as she would, she could not cure herself of the infection of Cowperwood, the lure that surrounded and substantiated a mind and spirit far greater than any other she had ever known. Neither honor, virtue, consistent charity, nor sympathy was there, but only a gay, foamy, unterrified sufficiency, and a creative, constructive sense of beauty that, like sunlit spray, glowing with all the irradiative glories of the morning, danced and fled, spun driftwise over a heavy sea of circumstance. Life, however dark and sombre, could never apparently cloud his soul. Brooding and idling in the wonder palace of his construction, Aileen could see what he was like. The silver fountain in the court of orchids, the peach-like glow of the pink marble chamber with its birds and flowers, the serried brilliance of his amazing art collection, were all like him, were really the colour of his soul. To think that after all she was not the one to bind him to subjection, to hold him by golden yet steely threads of fancy to the hem of her garment, to think that he should no longer walk a slave of his desire behind the chariot of her spiritual and physical superiority. Yet she could not give up. By this time Cowperwood had managed, through infinite tact and a stoic disregard of his own aches and pains, to re-establish at least a temporary working arrangement with the Carter household. To Mrs. Carter he was still a heaven-sent son of light. Actually, in a mournful way she pleaded for Cowperwood, vouching for his disinterestedness and long-standing generosity. Bernice, on the other hand, was swept between her craving for a great state for herself, luxury, power, and her desire to conform to the current ethics and morals of life. Cowperwood was married, and because of his attitude of affection for her, his money was tainted. She had long speculated on his relation to Aileen, the basis of their differences, had often wondered why neither she nor her mother had ever been introduced. What type of woman was the second Mrs. Cowperwood? Beyond generalities, Cowperwood had never mentioned her. Bernice actually thought of seeking her out in some inconspicuous way, but as it chanced, one night her curiosity was rewarded without effort. She was at the opera with friends, and her escort nudged her arm. "Have you noticed box 9? The lady in white satin, with the green lace shawl?" "Yes." Bernice raised her glasses. "Mrs. Frank Algernon Cowperwood, the wife of the Chicago millionaire. They have just built that house at 68th Street. He has part lease of number 9, I believe." Bernice almost started, but retained her composure, giving merely an indifferent glance. A little while after she adjusted her glasses carefully and studied Mrs. Cowperwood. She noted curiously that Aileen's hair was somewhat the colour of her own, a more carroty red. She studied her eyes, which were slightly ringed, her smooth cheeks and full mouth, thickened somewhat by drinking and dissipation. Aileen was good-looking, she thought, handsome in a material way, though so much older than herself. Was it merely age that was alienating Cowperwood, or was it some deep-seated intellectual difference? Obviously Mrs. Cowperwood was well over 40, a fact which did not give Bernice any sense of satisfaction or of advantage. She really did not care enough. It did occur to her, however, that this woman whom she was observing had probably given the best years of her life to Cowperwood, the brilliant years of her girlhood, and now he was tired of her. There were small, carefully powdered lines at the tails of Aileen's eyes and at the corners of her mouth. At the same time she seemed preternaturally gay, kittenish, spoiled. With her were 2 men, one a well-known actor, sinisterly handsome, a man with a brutal, unclean reputation, the other a young social pretender, both unknown to Bernice. Her knowledge was to come from her escort, a loquacious youth, more or less versed, as it happened, in the gay life of the city. "I hear that she is creating quite a stir in Bohemia," he observed. "If she expects to enter society, it's a poor way to begin, don't you think?" "Do you know that she expects to?" "All the usual signs are out. A box here, a house on Fifth Avenue." This study of Aileen puzzled and disturbed Bernice a little. Nevertheless, she felt immensely superior. Her soul seemed to soar over the plane Aileen inhabited. The type of the latter's escorts suggested error, a lack of social discrimination. Because of the high position he had succeeded in achieving, Cowperwood was entitled, no doubt, to be dissatisfied. His wife had not kept pace with him, or rather had not eluded him in his onward flight, had not run swiftly before like a winged victory. Bernice reflected that if she were dealing with such a man, he should never know her truly. He should be made to wonder and to doubt. Lines of care and disappointment should never mar her face. She would scheme and dream and conceal and evade. He should dance attendance, whoever he was. Nevertheless, here she herself was, at 22, unmarried, her background insecure, the very ground on which she walked treacherous. Braxmar knew, and Beals, Chadsey, and Cowperwood. At least 3 or 4 of her acquaintances must have been at the Waldorf on that fateful night. How long would it be before others became aware? She tried eluding her mother, Cowperwood, and the situation generally by freely accepting more extended invitations, and by trying to see whether there was not some opening for her in the field of art. She thought of painting, and essayed several canvases, which she took to dealers. The work was subtle, remote, fanciful, a snow scene with purple edges, a thinking satyr, lion-like in his heaviness, brooding over a cloudy valley, a lurking devil peering at a praying Marguerite, a Dutch interior inspired by Mrs. Batcher, and various dancing figures. Phlegmatic dealers of sombre mien admitted some promise, but pointed out the difficulty of sales. Beginners were numerous, art was long. If she went on, of course, let them see other things. She turned her thoughts to dancing. This art, in its interpretive sense, was just being introduced into America. A certain Althea Baker, having created a good deal of stir in society by this means. With the idea of duplicating or surpassing the success of this woman, Bernice conceived a dance series of her own. One was to be the Terror, a nymph dancing in the spring woods, but eventually pursued and terrorized by a faun. Another, the Peacock, a fancy illustrative of proud self-adulation. Another, the Vestal, a study from Roman choric worship. After spending considerable time at Pocono, evolving costumes, poses, and the like, Bernice finally hinted at the plan to Mrs. Batcher, declaring that she would enjoy the artistic outlet it would afford, and indicating at the same time that it might provide the necessary solution of a problem of ways and means.
"Why, Bevy, how you talk," commented Mrs. Batcher. "And with your possibilities. Why don't you marry first, and do your dancing afterward? You might compel a certain amount of attention that way."
"Because of hubby? How droll. Whom would you suggest that I marry at once?"
"Oh, when it comes to that,"
replied Mrs. Batcher, with a slight reproachful lift in her voice, and thinking of Kilmer Dwelmer.
"But surely your need isn't so pressing. If you were to take up professional dancing, I might have to cut you afterward, particularly if anyone else did."
She smiled, the sweetest, most sensible smile. Mrs. Batcher accompanied her suggestions nearly always with a slight sniff and cough. Bernice could see that the mere fact of this conversation made a slight difference. In Mrs. Batcher's world, poverty was a dangerous topic. The mere odour of it suggested a kind of horror, perhaps the equivalent of error or sin. Others, Bernice now suspected, would take affright even more swiftly. Subsequent to this, however, she made one slight investigation of those realms that govern professional theatrical engagements. It was a most disturbing experience. The mere colour and odour of the stuffy office, the gauche material attendants, the impossible aspirants and participants in this make-believe world, the crudeness, the effrontery, the materiality, the sensuality. It came to her as a sickening breath, and for the moment frightened her. What would become of refinement there? What of delicacy? How could one rise and sustain an individual dignity and control in such a world as this? Cowperwood was now suggesting, as a binding link, that he should buy a home for them in Park Avenue, where such social functions as would be of advantage to Bernice, and in some measure to himself, as an occasional guest, might be indulged in. Mrs. Carter, a fool of comfort, was pleased to welcome this idea. It promised to give her absolute financial security for the future. "I know how it is with you, Frank," she declared. "I know how you need some place that you can call a home. The whole difficulty will be with Bevy. Ever since that miserable puppy made those charges against me, I haven't been able to talk to her at all. She doesn't seem to want to do anything I suggest. You have much more influence with her than I have. If you explain, it may be all right." Instantly Cowperwood saw an opportunity. Intensely pleased with this confession of weakness on the part of the mother, he went to Bernice, but by his usual method of indirect direction. "You know, Bevy," he said one afternoon, when he found her alone, "I've been wondering if it wouldn't be better if I bought a large house for you and your mother here in New York, where you and she could do entertaining on a large scale. Since I can't spend my money on myself, I might as well spend it on someone who would make an interesting use of it. You might include me as an uncle, or father's cousin, or something of that sort," he added lightly. Bernice, who saw quite clearly the trap he was setting for her, was nonplussed. At the time, she could not help seeing that a house, if it were beautifully furnished, would be an interesting asset. People in society loved fixed, notable dwellings. She had observed that. What functions could not be held if only her mother's past were not charged against her? That was the great difficulty. It was almost an Arabian situation, heightened by the glitter of gold. And Cowperwood was always so diplomatic. He came forward with such a bland, engaging smile. His hands were so shapely and seeking. "A house such as you speak of would enlarge the debt beyond payment, I presume," she remarked sardonically, and with a sad, almost contemptuous gesture. Cowperwood realized how her piercing intellect was following his shifty trail, and winced. She must see that her fate was in his hands, but oh, if she would only surrender, how swiftly every dollar in his vast fortune would be piled humbly at her feet. She should have her heart's desire if money would buy it. She could say to him, "Go," and he would go. "Come," and he would come. "Bernice," he said, getting up, "I know what you think. You fancy I'm trying to further my own interests in this way, but I'm not. I wouldn't compromise you ultimately for all the wealth of India. I've told you where I stand. Every dollar that I have is yours to do future outside of you, none except art. I do not expect you to marry me. Take all that I have. Wipe society under my feet. Don't think that I will ever charge it up as a debt. I won't. I want you to hold your own. Just answer me one question. I won't ever ask another." "Yes?" "If I were single now, and you were not in love or married, would you consider me at all?" His eyes pleaded as never had they pleaded before. She started, looked concerned, severe, then relaxed as suddenly. "Let me see," she said, with a slight brightening of the eyes and a toss of the head. "That is a second cousin to a proposal, isn't it? You have no right to make it. You aren't single, and aren't likely to be. Why should I try to read the future?" She walked indifferently out of the room, and Cowperwood stayed a moment to think. Obviously, he had triumphed in a way. She had not taken great offense. She must like him, and would marry him if only Aileen. And now he wished more definitely and forcefully than ever that he were really and truly free. He felt that if ever he wished to attain Bernice, he must persuade Aileen to divorce him. Chapter 57. Aileen's Last Card. It was not until some little time after they were established in the new house that Aileen first came upon any evidence of the existence of Bernice Fleming. In a general way, she assumed that there were women, possibly some of whom she had known, Stephanie, Miss Hand, Florence Cochrane, or later arrivals. Yet, so long as they were not obtruded on her, she permitted herself the semi-comforting thought that things were not as bad as they might be. So long, indeed, as Cowperwood was genuinely promiscuous, so long as he trotted here and there, not snared by any particular siren, she could not despair. For, after all, she had ensnared him, and held him deliciously, without variation, she believed, for all of 10 years, a feat which no other woman had achieved before or after. Rita Solberg might have succeeded, The beast. How she hated the thought of Rita. By this time, however, Cowperwood was getting on in years. The day must come when he would be less keen for variability, or at least would think it no longer worthwhile to change. If only he did not find some one woman, some Circe, who would bind and enslave him in these later years, as she had herself done in his earlier ones, all might yet be well. At the same time, she lived in daily terror of a discovery which was soon to follow. She had gone out one day to pay a call on someone to whom Rhys Greer, the Chicago sculptor, had given her an introduction. Crossing Central Park in one of the new French machines which Cowperwood had purchased for her indulgence, her glance wandered down a branch road to where another automobile similar to her own was stalled. It was early in the afternoon, at which time Cowperwood was presumably engaged in Wall Street. Yet there he was, and with him 2 women, neither of whom in the speed of passing could Aileen quite make out. She had her car halted and driven to within seeing distance behind a clump of bushes. A chauffeur, whom she did not know, was tinkering at a handsome machine, while on the grass nearby stood Cowperwood and a tall, slender girl with red hair, somewhat like Aileen's own. Her expression was aloof, poetic, rhapsodical. Aileen could not analyze it, but it fixed her attention completely. In the tonneau sat an elderly lady whom Aileen at once assumed to be the girl's mother. Who were they? What was Cowperwood doing here in the park at this hour? Where were they going? With a horrible retch of envy she noted upon Cowperwood's face a smile, the like and import of which she well knew. How often she had seen it years and years before. Having escaped detection, she ordered her chauffeur to follow the car, which soon started at a safe distance. She saw Cowperwood and the 2 ladies put down at one of the great hotels, and followed them into the dining room, where, from behind a screen, after the most careful maneuvering, she had an opportunity of studying them at her leisure. She drank in every detail of Bernice's face, the delicately pointed chin, the clear, fixed blue eyes, the straight, sensitive nose and tawny hair. Calling the head waiter, she inquired the names of the 2 women, and in return for a liberal tip was informed at once. Mrs. Ira Carter, I believe, and her daughter Miss Fleming. Mrs. Carter was Mrs. Fleming once. Aileen followed them out eventually, and in her own car pursued them to their door, into which Cowperwood also disappeared. The next day, by telephoning the apartment to make inquiry, she learned that they actually lived there. After a few days of brooding, she employed a detective, and learned that Cowperwood was a constant visitor at the Carters, that the machine in which they rode was his, maintained at a separate garage, and that they were of society, truly. Aileen would never have followed the clue so vigorously had it not been for the look she had seen Cowperwood fix on the girl in the park, and in the restaurant. An air of soul hunger which could not be gainsaid. Let no one ridicule the terrors of unrequited love. Its tentacles are cancerous, its grip is of icy death. Sitting in her boudoir immediately after these events, driving, walking, shopping, calling on the few with whom she had managed to scrape an acquaintance, Aileen thought, morning, noon, and night, of this new woman. The pale, delicate face haunted her. What were those eyes, so remote in their gaze, surveying? Love? Cowperwood? Yes, yes. Gone in a flash, and permanently, as it seemed to Aileen, was the value of this house, her dream of a new social entrance. And she had already suffered so much, endured so much. Cowperwood being absent for a fortnight, she moped in her room, sighed, raged, and then began to drink. Finally she sent for an actor, who had once paid attention to her in Chicago, and whom she had later met here in the circle of the theatres. She was not so much burning with lust as determined in her drunken gloom that she would have revenge. For days there followed an orgy, in which wine, bestiality, mutual recrimination, hatred, and despair were involved. Sobering eventually, she wondered what Cowperwood would think of her now if he knew this. Could he ever love her any more? Could he even tolerate her? But what did he care? It served him right, the dog. She would show him. She would wreck his dream. She would make her own life a scandal, and his too. She would shame him before all the world. He should never have a divorce. He should never be able to marry a girl like that and leave her alone. Never, never, never. When Cowperwood returned, she snarled at him without vouchsafing an explanation. He suspected at once that she had been spying upon his maneuvers. Moreover, he did not fail to notice her heavy eyes, superheated cheeks, and sickly breath. Obviously, she had abandoned her dream of a social victory of some kind, and was entering on a career of what? Debauchery? Since coming to New York, she had failed utterly, he thought, to make any single intelligent move toward her social rehabilitation. The banal realms of art and the stage, with which in his absence or neglect she had trifled with here, as she had done in Chicago, were worse than useless. They were destructive. He must have a long talk with her one of these days, must confess frankly to his passion for Bernice, and appeal to her sympathy and good sense. What scenes would follow! Yet she might succumb at that. Despair, pride, disgust might move her. Besides, he could now bestow upon her a very large fortune. She could go to Europe, or remain here and live in luxury. He would always remain friendly with her, helpful, advisory, if she would permit it. The conversation which eventually followed on this topic was of such stuff as dreams are made of. It sounded hollow and unnatural within the walls where it took place. Consider the great house in Upper Fifth Avenue, its magnificent chambers aglow of a stormy Sunday night. Cowperwood was lingering in the city at this time, busy with a group of Eastern financiers who were influencing his contest in the state legislature of Illinois. Aileen was momentarily consoled by the thought that for him, perhaps, love might, after all, be a thing apart, a thing no longer vital and soul-controlling. Tonight he was sitting in the Court of Orchids, reading a book, The Diary of Cellini, which someone had recommended to him, stopping to think now and then of things in Chicago or Springfield, or to make a note. Outside, the rain was splashing in torrents on the electric-lighted asphalt of Fifth Avenue. The park opposite, a Corot-like shadow. Aileen was in the music room, strumming indifferently. She was thinking of times past. Lind, from whom she had not heard in half a year. Watson Skeet, the sculptor, who was also out of her ken at present. When Cowperwood was in the city and in the house, she was accustomed from habit to remain indoors or near. So great is the influence of past customs of devotion that they linger long past the hour when the act ceases to become valid. "What an awful night," she observed once, strolling to a window to peer out from behind a brocaded valance. "It is bad, isn't it?" replied Cowperwood as she returned. "Hadn't you thought of going anywhere this evening?" "No. Oh, no," replied Aileen indifferently. She rose restlessly from the piano and strolled on into the great picture gallery, stopping before one of Raphael Sanzio's Holy Families, only recently hung. She paused to contemplate the serene face, medieval, Madonna-esque, Italian. The lady seemed fragile, colourless, spineless, without life. Were there such women? Why did artists paint them? Yet the little Christ was sweet. Art bored Aileen unless others were enthusiastic. She craved only the fanfare of the living, not painted resemblances. She returned to the music room, to the Court of Orchids, and was just about to go upstairs to prepare herself a drink and read a novel when Cowperwood observed, "You're bored, aren't you?" "Oh, no. I'm used to lonely evenings," she replied quietly, and without any attempt at sarcasm. Relentless as he was in hewing life to his theory, hammering substance to the form of his thought, yet he was tender, too, in the manner of a rainbow dancing over an abyss. For the moment he wanted to say, "Poor girlie, you do have a hard time, don't you, with me?" But he reflected instantly how such a remark would be received. He meditated, holding his book in his hand above his knee, looking at the purling water that flowed and flowed in sprinkling showers over the sportive marble figures of mermaids, a triton, and nymphs astride of fishes. "You're really not happy in this state any more, are you?" he inquired. "Would you feel more comfortable if I stayed away entirely?" His mind had turned of a sudden to the one problem that was fretting him, and to the opportunities of this hour. "You would," she replied, for her boredom merely concealed her unhappiness in no longer being able to command, in the least, his interest or his sentiment. "Why do you say that in just that way?" he asked. "Because I know you would. I know why you ask. You know well enough that it isn't anything I want to do that is concerned. It is what you want to do. You'd like to turn me off like an old horse now that you are tired of me, and so you ask whether I would feel any more comfortable. What a liar you are, Frank. How really shifty you are. I don't wonder you're a multimillionaire. If you could live long enough, you would eat up the whole world. Don't you think for a moment that I don't know of Bernice Fleming here in New York, and how you're dancing attendance on her, because I do. I know you have been hanging about her for months and months, ever since we have been here, and for long before. You think she's wonderful now because she's young and in society. I've seen you in the Waldorf, and in the park, hanging on her every word, looking at her with adoring eyes. What a fool you are to be so big a man. Every little snip, if she has pink cheeks and a doll's face, can wind you right around her finger. Rita Solberg did it, Stephanie Platoff did it, Florence Cochrane did it, Cecily Hagenin, and heaven knows how many more that I've never heard of. I suppose Mrs. Hand still lives with you in Chicago, the cheap strumpet. Now it's Bernice Fleming, and her frump of a mother. From all I can learn, you haven't been able to get her yet, because her mother's too shrewd, perhaps, but you probably will in the end. It isn't you so much as your money that they're after. Pah! Well, I'm unhappy enough, but it isn't anything you can remedy any more. Whatever you could do to make me unhappy, you've done. And now you talk of my being happier away from you. Clever boy, you. I know you the way I know my 10 fingers. You don't deceive me at any time in any way any more. I can't do anything about it. I can't stop you from making a fool of yourself with every woman you meet, and having people talk from one end of the country to the other. Why, for a woman to be seen with you is enough to fix her reputation forever. Right now, all Broadway knows you're running after Bernice Fleming. Her name will soon be as sweet as those of the others you've had. She might as well give herself to you. If she ever had a decent reputation, it's gone by now, you can depend upon that. These remarks irritated Cowperwood greatly, enraged him, particularly her references to Bernice. What were you to do with such a woman, he thought. Her tongue was becoming unbearable. Her speech, in its persistence and force, was that of a termagant. Surely he had made a great mistake in marrying her. At the same time, the control of her was largely in his own hands even yet. "Aileen," he said coolly at the end of her speech, "you talk too much. You rave. You're growing vulgar, I believe. Now let me tell you something." And he fixed her with a hard, quieting eye. "I've no apologies to make, think what you please. I know why you say what you do. But here is the point. I want you to get it straight and clear. It may make some difference eventually if you're any kind of woman at all. I don't care for you any more. If you want to put it another way, I'm tired of you. I have been for a long while. That's why I've run with other women. If I hadn't been tired of you, I wouldn't have done it. What's more, I'm in love with somebody else. Bernice Fleming. And I expect to stay in love. I wish I were free so I could rearrange my life on a different basis and find a little more comfort before I die. You don't really care for me anymore. You can't. I'll admit I've treated you badly. But if I had really loved you, I wouldn't have done it, would I? It isn't my fault that love died in me, is it? It isn't your fault. I'm not blaming you. Love isn't a bunch of coals that can be blown by an artificial bellows into a flame at any time. It's out, and that's an end of it. Since I don't love you and can't, why should you want me to stay near you? Why shouldn't you let me go and give me a divorce? You'll be just as happy or unhappy away from me as with me. Why not? I want to be free again. I'm miserable here, and have been for a long time. I'll make any arrangement that seems fair and right to you. I'll give you this house, these pictures, though I really don't see what you'd want with them." Cowperwood had no intention of giving up the gallery if he could help it. "I'll settle on you for life any income you desire, or I'll give you a fixed sum outright. I want to be free, and I want you to let me be. Now, why won't you be sensible and let me do this?" During this harangue, Cowperwood had first sat and then stood. At the statement that his love was really dead, the first time he had ever boldly and squarely announced it, Aileen had paled a little, and put her hand to her forehead over her eyes. It was then he had risen. He was cold, determined, a little revengeful for the moment. She realized now that he meant this, that in his heart was no least feeling for all that had gone before, no sweet memories, no binding thoughts of happy hours, days, weeks, years, that were so glittering and wonderful to her in retrospect. Great heavens, it was really true. His love was dead, he had said it. But for the nonce she could not believe it, she would not. It really couldn't be true.
Frank,
she began, coming toward him, the while he moved away to evade her. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling, her lips moving in an emotional, wavy, rhythmic way.
You really don't mean that, do you? Love isn't wholly dead, is it? All the love you used to feel for me? Oh, Frank, I have raged, I have hated, I have said terrible, ugly things, but it has been because I have been in love with you. All the time I have. You know that. I felt so bad. Oh, God, how bad I have felt. Frank, you don't know it, but my pillow has been wet many and many a night. I have cried and cried. I've got up and walked the floor. I have drunk whiskey, plain raw whiskey, because something hurt me and I wanted to kill the pain. I've gone with other men, one after another, you know that. But oh, Frank, Frank, you know that I didn't want to, that I didn't mean to. I've always despised the thought of them afterward. It was only because I was lonely and because you wouldn't pay any attention to me or be nice to me. Oh, how I have longed and longed for just one loving hour with you, one night, one day. There are women who could suffer in silence, but I can't. My mind won't let me alone, Frank. My thoughts won't. I can't help thinking how I used to run to you in Philadelphia, when you would meet me on your way home, or when I used to come to you on 9th Street or on 11th. Oh, Frank, I probably did wrong to your first wife. I see it now, how she must have suffered. But I was just a silly girl then, and I didn't know. Don't you remember how I used to come to you in 9th Street, and how I saw you day after day in the penitentiary in Philadelphia? You said then you would love me always, and that you would never forget. Can't you love me any more? Just a little? Is it really true that your love is dead? Am I so old, so changed? Oh, Frank, please don't say that. Please don't. Please, 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 I beg of you.
She tried to reach him and put a hand on his arm, but he stepped aside. To him, as he looked at her now, she was the antithesis of anything he could brook, let alone desire, artistically or physically. The charm was gone, the spell broken. It was another type, another point of view he required, but above all, and principally, youth. Youth. The spirit, for instance, that was in Bernice Fleming. He was sorry, in his way. He felt sympathy, but it was like the tinkling of a far-off sheep bell, the moaning of a whistling buoy heard over the thrash of night-black waves on a stormy sea. "You don't understand how it is, Aileen," he said. "I can't help myself. My love is dead. It's gone. I can't recall it. I can't feel it. I wish I could, but I can't. You must understand that. Some things are possible and some are not." He looked at her, but with no relenting. Aileen, for her part, saw in his eyes nothing, as she believed, save cold, philosophic logic. The man of business, the thinker, the bargainer, the plotter. At the thought of the adamantine character of his soul, which could thus defiantly close its gates on her forever and ever, she became wild, angry, feverish, not quite sane.
"Oh, don't say that," she pleaded foolishly. "Please don't. Please don't say that. It might come back a little if you would only believe in it. Don't you see how I feel? Don't you see how it is?"
She dropped to her knees and clasped him about the waist.
"Oh, Frank! Oh, Frank! Oh, Frank!" she began to call, crying. "I can't stand it! I can't! I can't! I can't! I shall die!"
"Don't give way like that, Aileen," he pleaded. "It doesn't do any good. I can't lie to myself. I don't want to lie to you. Life is too short. Facts are facts. If I could say and believe that I loved you, I would say so now, but I can't. I don't love you. Why should I say that I do?" In the content of Aileen's nature was a portion that was purely histrionic, a portion that was childish, petted and spoiled, a portion that was sheer unreason, and a portion that was splendid emotion, deep, dark, involved. At this statement of Cowperwood's, which seemed to throw her back on herself forever and ever to be alone, she first pleaded willingness to compromise, to share. She had not fought Stephanie Platoff, she had not fought Florence Cochrane, nor Cecily Hagnin, nor Miss Hand, nor indeed anybody after Rita, and she would fight no more. She had not spied on him in connection with Bernice. She had accidentally met them. True, she had gone with other men, but... Bernice was beautiful, she admitted it. But so was she in her way still. A little, still. Couldn't he find a place for her yet in his life? Wasn't there room for both? At this expression of humiliation and defeat, Cowperwood was sad, sick, almost nauseated. How could one argue? How make her understand? I wish it were possible, Aileen, he concluded finally and heavily, but it isn't. All at once she arose, her eyes red but dry. You don't love me then at all, do you? Not a bit. No, Aileen, I don't. I don't mean by that I dislike you. I don't mean to say that you aren't interesting in your way as a woman, and that I don't sympathize with you, I do. But I don't love you any more. I can't. The thing I used to feel, I can't feel any more. She paused for a moment, uncertain how to take this, the while she whitened, grew more tense, more spiritual than she had been in many a day. Now she felt desperate, angry, sick, but like the scorpion that ringed by fire can only turn on itself. What a hell life was, she told herself. How it slipped away and left one aging, horribly alone. Love was nothing, faith nothing, nothing, nothing. A fine light of conviction, intensity, intention lit her eye for the moment. Very well, then, she said coolly, tensely. I know what I'll do. I'll not live this way. I'll not live beyond tonight. I want to die anyhow, and I will. It was by no means a cry, this last, but a calm statement. It should prove her love. To Cowperwood it seemed unreal, bravado, a momentary rage intended to frighten him. She turned and walked up the grand staircase, which was near, a splendid piece of marble and bronze 15 feet wide, with marble nereids and newel posts and dancing figures worked into the stone. She went into her room quite calmly, and took up a steel paper-cutter of dagger design, a knife with a handle of bronze and a point of great sharpness. Coming out and going along the balcony over the court of orchids where Cowperwood was still seated, she entered the sunrise room with its pool of water, its birds, its benches, its vines. Locking the door, she sat down, and then suddenly, baring an arm, jabbed a vein, ripped it for inches, and sat there to bleed. Now she would see whether she could die, whether he would let her. Uncertain, astonished, not able to believe that she could be so rash, not believing that her feeling could be so great, Cowperwood still remained where she had left him, wondering. He had not been so greatly moved. The tantrums of women were common, and yet, could she really be contemplating death? How could she? How ridiculous! Life was so strange, so mad. But this was Aileen who had just made this threat, and she had gone up the stairs to carry it out, perhaps. Impossible. How could it be? Yet back of all his doubts there was a kind of sickening feeling of dread. He recalled how she had assaulted Rita Solberg. He hurried up the steps now and into her room. She was not there. He went quickly along the balcony, looking here and there until he came to the sunrise room. She must be there, for the door was shut. He tried it. It was locked. "Aileen?" he called. "Aileen, are you in there?" No answer. He listened. Still no answer. "Aileen," he repeated, "are you in there? What damned nonsense is this, anyhow?" George, he thought to himself, stepping back. She might do it, too. Perhaps she has. He could not hear anything save the old chattering of a toucan, aroused by the light she had switched on. Perspiration stood out on his brow. He shook the knob, pushed a bell for a servant, called for keys which had been made for every door, called for a chisel and hammer. "Aileen," he said, "if you don't open the door this instant, I will see that it is opened. It can be opened quick enough." Still no sound. "Damn it!" he exclaimed, becoming wretched, horrified. A servant brought the keys. The right one would not enter. A second was on the other side. "There is a bigger hammer somewhere," Cowperwood said. "Get it. Get me a chair." Meanwhile, with terrific energy, using a large chisel, he forced the door. There, on one of the stone benches of the lovely room, sat Aileen, the level pool of water before her, the sunrise glow over everything, tropic birds in their branches, and she, her hair dishevelled, her face pale, one arm, her left, hanging down, ripped and bleeding, trickling a thick stream of rich red blood. On the floor was a pool of blood, fierce scarlet, like some rich cloth, already turning darker in places. Cowperwood paused, amazed. He hurried forward, seized her arm, made a bandage of a torn handkerchief above the wound, sent out for a surgeon, saying the while, "How could you, Aileen? How impossible! To try to take your life? This isn't love. It isn't even madness. It's foolish acting." "Don't you really care?" she asked. "How can you ask? How can you really do this?" He was angry, hurt, glad that she was alive, shamed. Many things. "Don't you really care?" she repeated wearily. "Aileen, this is nonsense. I will not talk to you about it now. Have you cut yourself anywhere else?" he asked, feeling about her bosom and sides. "Then why not let me die?" she replied in the same manner. "I will some day. I want to." "Well, you may some day," he replied, "but not tonight. I scarcely think you want to now. This is too much, Aileen, really impossible." He drew himself up and looked at her, cool, unbelieving, the light of control, even of victory, in his eyes. As he had suspected, it was not truly real. She would not have killed herself. She had expected him to come, to make the old effort. Very good. He would see her safely in bed, and in a nurse's hands, and would then avoid her as much as possible in the future. If her intention was genuine, she would carry it out in his absence, but he did not believe she would. Chapter 58. A Marauder upon the Commonwealth. The spring and summer months of 1897 and the late fall of 1898 witnessed the final closing battle between Frank Algernon Cowperwood and the forces inimical to him, in so far as the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and indeed the United States of America were concerned. When in 1896 a new governor and a new group of state representatives were installed, Cowperwood decided that it would be advisable to continue the struggle at once. By the time this new legislature should convene for its labors, a year would have passed since Governor Swanson had vetoed the original Public Service Commission bill. By that time, public sentiment as aroused by the newspapers would have had time to cool. Already, through various favorable financial interests, particularly Heckelheimer, Gottlieb & Co., and all the subsurface forces they represented, he had attempted to influence the incoming governor, and had in part succeeded. The new governor, in this instance, one Corporal A.E. Archer, or ex-Congressman Archer, as he was sometimes called, was, unlike Swanson, a curious mixture of the commonplace and the ideal, one of those shiftily loyal and loyally shifty who make their upward way by devious, if not too reprehensible, methods. He was a little man, stocky, brown-haired, brown-eyed, vigorous, witty, with the ordinary politician's estimate of public morality, namely, that there is no such thing. A drummer boy at 14 in the War of the Rebellion, a private at 16 and 18, he had subsequently been breveted for conspicuous military service. At this later time, he was head of the Grand Army of the Republic, and conspicuous in various stirring eleemosynary efforts on behalf of the old soldiers, their widows and orphans. A fine American, flag-waving, tobacco-chewing, foul-swearing little man was this, and one with noteworthy political ambitions. Other Grand Army men had been conspicuous in the lists of presidential nominations. Why not he? An excellent orator, in a high falsetto way, and popular because of good fellowship, presence, force. He was by nature materially and commercially minded, therefore without basic appeal to the higher ranks of intelligence. In seeking the nomination for governorship, he had made the usual overtures, and had in turn been sounded by Heckelheimer, Gottlieb, and various other corporate interests who were in league with Cowperwood as to his attitude in regard to a proposed public service commission. At first he had refused to commit himself. Later, finding that the CW&I and the Chicago and Pacific, very powerful railroads both, were interested, and that other candidates were running him a tight chase in the gubernatorial contest, he succumbed in a measure, declaring privately that in case the legislature proved to be strongly in favor of the idea, and the newspapers not too crushingly opposed, he might be willing to stand as its advocate. Other candidates expressed similar views, but Corporal Archer proved to have the greater following, and was eventually nominated and comfortably elected. Shortly after the new legislature had convened, it so chanced that a certain A.S. Rotherhite, publisher of the South Chicago Journal, was one day accidentally sitting as a visitor in the seat of a state representative by the name of Clarence Mulligan. While so occupied, Rotherhite was familiarly slapped on the back by a certain Senator Ladrigo of Menard, and was invited to come out into the rotunda, where, posing as Representative Mulligan, he was introduced by Senator Ladrigo to a stranger by the name of Gerard. The latter, with but few preliminary remarks, began as follows. "Mr. Mulligan, I want to fix it with you in regard to this Southwark bill, which is so soon to come up in the House. We have 70 votes, but we want 90. The fact that the bill has gone to a second reading in the Senate shows our strength. I'm authorized to come to terms with you this morning, if you would like. Your vote is worth $2,000 to you the moment the bill is signed." Mr. Rotherhite, who happened to be a newly recruited member of the opposition press, proved very canny in this situation. "Excuse me," he stammered. "I did not understand your name." "Gerard." "Gerard. Henry A. Gerard," replied this other. "Thank you. I will think it over," was the response of the presumed Representative Mulligan. Strange to state, at this very instant, the authentic Mulligan actually appeared, heralded loud by several of his colleagues who happened to be lingering nearby in the lobby, whereupon the anomalous Mr. Gerard and the crafty Senator Ladrigo discreetly withdrew. Needless to say that Mr. Rotherhite hurried at once to the forces of righteousness. The press should spread this little story broadcast. It was a very meaty incident, and it brought the whole matter once more into the fatal, poisonous field of press discussion. At once the Chicago papers flew to arms. The cry was raised that the same old sinister Cowperwoodian forces were at work. The members of the Senate and House were solemnly warned. The sterling attitude of ex-Governor Swanson was held up as an example to the present Governor Archer. "The whole idea," observed an editorial in Truman Leslie MacDonald's Enquirer, "smacks of chicane, political subtlety, and political jugglery. Well do the citizens of Chicago and the people of Illinois know who and what particular organization would prove the true beneficiaries. We do not want a public service commission at the behest of a private street railway corporation. Are the tentacles of Frank A. Cowperwood to envelop this legislature as they did the last?" This broadside, coming in conjunction with various hostile rumblings in other places, aroused Cowperwood to emphatic language. "They can go to the devil," he said to Addison one day at lunch. "I have a right to an extension of my franchises for 50 years, and I'm going to get it. Look at New York and Philadelphia. Why, the Eastern houses laugh. They don't understand such a situation. It's all the inside work of this Hand Scrihart crowd. I know what they're doing and who's pulling the strings. The newspapers yap every time they give an order. Hyssop waltzes every time Arneal moves. Little MacDonald is a stool pigeon for Hand. It's got down so low now that it's anything to beat Cowperwood. Well, they won't beat me. I'll find a way out. The legislature will pass a bill allowing for a 50-year franchise, and the governor will sign it. I'll see to that personally. I have at least 18,000 stockholders who want a decent run for their money, and I propose to give it to them. Aren't other men getting rich? Aren't other corporations earning 10 and 12%? Why shouldn't I? Is Chicago any the worse? Do I employ 20,000 men and pay them well? All this palaver about the rights of the people and the duty to the public. Rats! Does Mr. Hand acknowledge any duty to the public where his special interests are concerned, or Mr. Scrihart, or Mr. Arneal? The newspapers be damned. I know my rights. An honest legislature will give me a decent franchise to save me from the political sharks." By this time, however, the newspapers had become as subtle and powerful as the politicians themselves. Under the great dome of the Capitol at Springfield, in the halls and conference chambers of the Senate and House, in the hotels and in the rural districts, wherever any least information was to be gathered, were their representatives, to see, to listen, to pry. Out of this contest they were gaining prestige and cash. By them were the reform aldermen persuaded to call mass meetings in their respective districts. Property owners were urged to organize. A committee of 100 prominent citizens led by Hand and Scrihart was formed. It was not long before the halls, chambers, and committee rooms of the Capitol at Springfield, and the corridors of the one principal hotel, were being tramped over almost daily by rampant delegations of ministers, reform aldermen, and civil committeemen, who arrived speechifying, threatening, and haranguing, and departed only to make room for another relay. "Say, what do you think of these delegations, Senator?" inquired a certain Representative Greeno of Senator George Christian of Grundy, one morning, the while a group of Chicago clergymen, accompanied by the mayor and several distinguished private citizens, passed through the rotunda on their way to the Committee on Railroads, where the House bill was privily being discussed. "Don't you think they speak well for our civic pride and moral upbringing?" He raised his eyes and crossed his fingers over his waistcoat in the most sanctimonious and reverential attitude. "Yes, dear pastor," replied the irreverent Christian, without the shadow of a smile. He was a little, sallow, wiry man, with eyes like a ferret, a small moustache and goatee ornamenting his face. "But do not forget that the Lord has called us also to this work." "Even so," acquiesced Greenough, "we must not weary in well-doing. The harvest is truly plenteous, and the labourers are few." "Tut, tut, pastor, don't overdo it. You might make me larf," replied Christian, and the twain parted, with knowing and yet weary smiles. Yet how little did the accommodating attitude of these gentlemen avail in silencing the newspapers. The damnable newspapers. They were here, there, and everywhere reporting each least fragment of rumour, conversation, or imaginary programme. Never did the citizens of Chicago receive so keen a drilling in statecraft, its subtleties and ramifications. The President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House were singled out and warned separately as to their duty. A page a day devoted to legislative proceedings in this quarter was practically the custom of the situation. Cowperwood was here personally on the scene, brazen, defiant, logical, the courage of his convictions in his eyes, the power of his magnetism fairly enslaving men. Throwing off the mask of disinterestedness, if any might be said to have covered him, he now frankly came out in the open, and, journeying to Springfield, took quarters at the principal hotel. Like a general in time of battle, he marshalled his forces about him. In the warm, moonlit atmosphere of June nights, when the streets of Springfield were quiet, the great plain of Illinois bathed for hundreds of miles from north to south in a sweet effulgence, and the rurals slumbering in their simple homes, he sat conferring with his lawyers and legislative agents. Pity in such a crisis the poor country Jake legislator, torn between his desire for a justifiable and expedient gain, and his fear lest he should be assailed as a betrayer of the people's interests. To some of these small-town legislators, who had never seen as much as $2,000 in cash in all their days, the problem was soul-racking. Men gathered in private rooms and hotel parlors to discuss it. They stood in their rooms at night and thought about it alone. The sight of big business compelling its desires the while the people went begging was destructive. Many a romantic, illusioned, idealistic young country editor, lawyer, or statesman was here made over into a minor cynic or bribe-taker. Men were robbed of every vestige of faith or even of charity. They came to feel, perforce, that there was nothing outside the capacity for taking and keeping. The surface might appear commonplace, ordinary men of the state of Illinois going here and there, simple farmers and small-town senators and representatives conferring and meditating and wondering what they could do. Yet a jungle-like complexity was present, a dark, rank growth of horrific but avid life. Life at the full, life knife in hand, life blazing with courage and dripping at the jaws with hunger. However, because of the terrific uproar, the more cautious legislators were by degrees becoming fearful. Friends in their hometowns, at the instigation of the papers, were beginning to write to them. Political enemies were taking heart. It meant too much of a sacrifice on the part of everybody. In spite of the fact that the bait was apparently within easy reach, many became evasive and disturbed. When a certain Representative Sparks, cocked and primed, with the bill in his pocket, arose upon the floor of the House asking leave to have it spread upon the minutes, there was an instant explosion. The privilege of the floor was requested by 100. Another representative, Disback, being in charge of the opposition to Cowperwood, had made a count of noses, and was satisfied, in spite of all subtlety on the part of the enemy, that he had at least 102 votes, the necessary 2/3 wherewith to crush any measure which might originate on the floor. Nevertheless, his followers, because of caution, voted it to a second and a third reading. All sorts of amendments were made, one for a 3-cent fare during the rush hours, another for a 20% tax on gross receipts. In amended form, the measure was sent to the Senate, where the changes were stricken out and the bill once more returned to the House. Here, to Cowperwood's chagrin, signs were made manifest that it could not be passed. "It can't be done, Frank," said Judge Dickensheets. "It's too grilling a game. Their home papers are after them. They can't live."
Consequently, a second measure was devised, more soothing and lulling to the newspapers, but far less satisfactory to Cowperwood.
It conferred upon the Chicago City Council, by a trick of revising the old Horse and Dummy Act of 1865, the right to grant a franchise for 50 instead of for 20 years. This meant that Cowperwood would have to return to Chicago and fight out his battle there. It was a severe blow, yet better than nothing. Providing that he could win one more franchise battle within the walls of the City Council in Chicago, it would give him all that he desired. But could he? Had he not come here to the legislature, especially to evade such a risk? His motives were enduring such a blistering exposure. Yet perhaps, after all, if the price were large enough, the Chicago councilman would have more real courage than these country legislators, would dare more. They would have to. So, after heaven knows what desperate whisperings, conferences, arguments, and heartening of members, there was originated a second measure which, after the defeat of the first bill, 104 to 49, was introduced by way of a very complicated path through the Judiciary Committee. It was passed, and Governor Archer, after heavy hours of contemplation and self-examination, signed it. A little man, mentally, he failed to estimate an aroused popular fury at its true import to him. At his elbow was Cowperwood, in the clear light of day, snapping his fingers in the face of his enemies, showing by the hard, cheerful glint in his eye that he was still master of the situation. Besides, in the event of the passage of the bill, Cowperwood had promised to make Archer independently rich, a cash reward of $500,000. Chapter 59. Capital and Public Rights. Between the passage on June 5, 1897, of the Mears Bill, so christened after the doughty representative who had received a small fortune for introducing it, and its presentation to the Chicago City Council in December of the same year, what broodings, plottings, politickings, and editorializings on the part of all and sundry. In spite of the intense feeling of opposition to Cowperwood, there was at the same time in local public life one stratum of commercial and phlegmatic substance that could not view him in an altogether unfavorable light. They were in business themselves. His lines passed their doors and served them. They could not see wherein his street railway service differed so much from that which others might give. Here was the type of materialist who, in Cowperwood's defiance, saw a justification of his own material point of view, and was not afraid to say so. But as against these, there were the preachers, poor wind-blown sticks of unreason, who saw only what the current palaver seemed to indicate. Again, there were the anarchists, socialists, single-taxers, and public ownership advocates. There were the very poor, who saw in Cowperwood's wealth and in the fabulous stories of his New York home, and of his art collection, a heartless exploitation of their needs. At this time, the feeling was spreading broadcast in America that great political and economic changes were at hand, that the tyranny of iron masters at the top was to give way to a richer, freer, happier life for the rank and file. A national 8-hour-a-day law was being advocated, and the public ownership of public franchises. And here now was a great street railway corporation serving a population of 1.5 million, occupying streets which the people themselves created by their presence, taking toll from all these humble citizens to the amount of 16 and 18 millions of dollars in the year, and giving in return, so the papers said, poor service, shabby cars, no seats at rush hours, no universal transfers. As a matter of fact, there were in operation 362 separate transfer points, and no adequate tax on the immense sums earned. The working man who read this by gas or lamplight in the kitchen or parlor of his shabby flat or cottage, and who read also in other sections of his paper of the free, reckless, glorious lives of the rich, felt himself to be defrauded of a portion of his rightful inheritance. It was all a question of compelling Frank A. Cowperwood to do his duty by Chicago. He must not again be allowed to bribe the aldermen. He must not be allowed to have a 50-year franchise. the privilege of granting which he had already bought from the state legislature by the degradation of honest men. He must be made to succumb, to yield to the forces of law and order. It was claimed, and with a justice of which those who made the charge were by no means fully aware, that the Mears Bill had been put through the House and Senate by the use of cold cash, proffered even to the governor himself. No legal proof of this was obtainable, but Cowperwood was assumed to be a briber on a giant scale. By the newspaper cartoons, he was represented as a pirate commander ordering his men to scuttle another vessel, the ship of public rights. He was pictured as a thief, a black mask over his eyes, and as a seducer, throttling Chicago, the fair maiden, while he stole her purse. The fame of this battle was by now becoming worldwide. In Montreal, in Cape Town, in Buenos Aires, in Melbourne, in London, and Paris, men were reading of this singular struggle. At last, and truly, he was a national and international figure. His original dream, however, modified by circumstances, had literally been fulfilled. Meanwhile, be it admitted that the local elements in finance, which had brought about this terrific onslaught on Cowperwood, were not a little disturbed as to the eventual character of the child of their own creation. Here at last was a public opinion defiantly inimical to Cowperwood, but here also were they themselves, tremendous profit-holders, with a desire for just such favours as Cowperwood himself had exacted, deliberately setting out to kill the goose that could lay the golden egg. Men such as Heckelheimer, Gottlieb, Fischel, tremendous capitalists in the East, and foremost in the directorates of huge transcontinental lines, international banking houses and the like, were amazed that the newspapers and the anti-Cowperwood element should have gone so far in Chicago. Had they no respect for capital? Did they not know that long-time franchises were practically the basis of all modern capitalistic prosperity? Such theories, as were now being advocated here, would spread to other cities unless checked. America might readily become anti-capitalistic, socialistic. Public ownership might appear as a workable theory. And then what? "Those men out there are very foolish," observed Mr. Heckelheimer, at one time to Mr. Fischel of Fischel, Stone, and Simmons. "I can't see that Mr. Cowperwood is different from any other organizer of his day. He seems to me perfectly sound and able. All his companies pay. There are no better investments than the North and West Chicago railways. It would be advisable, in my judgment, that all the lines out there should be consolidated and be put in his charge. He would make money for the stockholders. He seems to know how to run street railways." "You know," replied Mr. Fischel, as smug and white as Mr. Heckelheimer, and in thorough sympathy with his point of view, "I've been thinking of something like that myself. All this quarreling should be hushed up. It's very bad for business, very. Once they get that public ownership nonsense started, it will be hard to stop. There has been too much of it already." Mr. Fischel was stout and round, like Mr. Heckelheimer, but much smaller. He was little more than a walking mathematical formula. In his cranium were financial theorems and syllogisms of the second, third, and fourth power only. And now, behold a new trend of affairs. Mr. Timothy Arneel, attacked by pneumonia, dies, and leaves his holdings in Chicago City to his eldest son, Edward Arneel. Mr. Fischel and Mr. Heckelheimer, through agents and then direct, approach Mr. Merrill on behalf of Cowperwood. There is much talk of profits. How much more profitable has been the Cowperwood regime over street railway lines than that of Mr. Schryhart? Mr. Fischel is interested in allaying socialistic excitement. So by this time is Mr. Merrill. Directly hereafter, Mr. Heckelheimer approaches Mr. Edward Arneel, who is not nearly so forceful as his father, though he would like to be so. He, strange to relate, has come rather to admire Cowperwood, and sees no advantage in a policy that can only tend to municipalize local lines. Mr. Merrill, for Mr. Fisher, approaches Mr. Hand. "Never, never, never," says Hand. Mr. Heckelheimer approaches Mr. Hand. "Never, never, never, to the devil with Mr. Cowperwood." But as a final emissary for Mr. Heckelheimer and Mr. Fisher, there now appears Mr. Morgan Frankhauser, the partner of Mr. Hand in a $7 million traction scheme in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Why will Mr. Hand be so persistent? Why pursue a scheme of revenge which only stirs up the masses and makes municipal ownership a valid political idea, thus disturbing capital everywhere? Why not trade his Chicago holdings to him, Frankhauser, for Pittsburgh traction stock, share and share alike, and then fight Cowperwood all he pleases on the outside? Mr. Hand, puzzled, astounded, scratching his round head, slaps a heavy hand on his desk. "Never!" he exclaims. "Never, by God, as long as I am alive and in Chicago." And then he yields. Life does shifty things, he is forced to reflect in a most puzzled way. Never would he have believed it. "Schryhart," he declared to Frankhauser, "will never come in. He will die first. Poor old Timothy, if he were alive, he wouldn't either." "Leave Mr. Schryhart out of it, for heaven's sake," pleaded Mr. Frankhauser, a genial American German. "Haven't I troubles enough?" Mr. Schryhart is enraged. Never, never, never. He will sell out first. But he is in a minority, and Mr. Frankhauser, for Mr. Fischel or Mr. Heckelheimer, will gladly take his holdings. Now, behold, in the autumn of 1897, all rival Chicago street railway lines brought to Mr. Cowperwood on a platter, as it were, a golden platter. "We have it fixed," confidentially declared Mr. Gottlieb to Mr. Cowperwood, over an excellent dinner in the sacred precincts of the Metropolitan Club in New York. Time, 8:30 p.m. Wine, sparkling Burgundy. "A telegram come just today, from Frankhauser. A nice man, dot. You should meet him sometime. Hand, he sells out his stock to Frankhauser. Merrill and Edward O'Neill work with us. We handle everything for them. Mr. Fischel will have his friends pick up all the local shares he can, and with these three we control the board. Schryhart is out. He says he will resign. Very good. I don't suppose that will make you weep any. It all hinges now on whether you can get that 50-year franchise ordinance through the city council or not. Heckelheimer says he prefers you to all others to run things. He will leave everything positively in your hands. Frankhauser says the same. What Heckelheimer says he does. Now, there you are. It's up to you. I wish you much joy. It is no small job you have, beating the newspapers, and you still have Hand and Schryhart against you. Mr. Heckelheimer asked me to pay his compliments to you, and to say will you dine with him next week, or may he dine with you, whichever is most convenient. So." In the mayor's chair of Chicago at this time sat a man named Walden H. Lucas. Aged 38, he was politically ambitious. He had the elements of popularity, the knack or luck of fixing public attention. A fine, upstanding, healthy young buck he was, subtle, vigorous, a cool, direct, practical thinker and speaker, an eager, enigmatic dreamer of great political honors to come, anxious to play his cards just right, to make friends, to be the pride of the righteous, and yet the not too uncompromising foe of the wicked. In short, a youthful, hopeful Western Machiavelli, and one who could, if he chose, serve the cause of the anti-Cowperwood struggle exceedingly well indeed. Cowperwood, disturbed, visits the mayor in his office. "Mr. Lucas, what is it you personally want? What can I do for you? Is it future political preferment you are after?" "Mr. Cowperwood, there isn't anything you can do for me. You do not understand me, and I do not understand you. You cannot understand me because I am an honest man." "Ye gods," replied Cowperwood. "This is certainly a case of self-esteem and great knowledge. Good afternoon." Shortly thereafter the mayor was approached by one Mr. Carker, who was the shrewd, cold, and yet magnetic leader of democracy in the state of New York. Said Carker, "You see, Mr. Lucas, the great money houses of the East are interested in this local contest here in Chicago. For example, Heckelheimer, Gottlieb & Co. would like to see a consolidation of all the lines on a basis that will make them an attractive investment for buyers generally, and will at the same time be fair and right to the city. A 20-year contract is much too short a term in their eyes. 50 is the least they can comfortably contemplate, and they would prefer 100. It is little enough for so great an outlay. The policy now being pursued here can lead only to the public ownership of public utilities, and that is something which the National Democratic Party at large can certainly not afford to advocate at present. It would antagonize the money element from coast to coast. Any man whose political record was definitely identified with such a movement would have no possible chance at even a state nomination, let alone a national one. He could never be elected. I make myself clear, do I not?
You do.
A man can just as easily be taken from the mayor's office in Chicago as from the governor's office at Springfield, pursued Mr. Carker. Mr. Heckelheimer and Mr. Fischel have personally asked me to call on you. If you want to be mayor of Chicago again for 2 years, or governor next year, until the time for picking a candidate for the presidency arrives, suit yourself. In the meantime, you'll be unwise in my judgment to saddle yourself with this public ownership idea. The newspapers in fighting Mr. Cowperwood have raised an issue which never should have been raised.
After Mr. Carker's departure, arrived Mr. Edward Arneill, of local renown, and then Mr. Jacob Bethel, the Democratic leader in San Francisco, both offering suggestions which, if followed, might result in mutual support. There were, in addition, delegations of powerful Republicans from Minneapolis and from Philadelphia. Even the president of the Lake City Bank and the president of the Prairie National, once anti-Cowperwood, arrived to say what had already been said. So it went. Mr. Lucas was greatly nonplussed. A political career was surely a difficult thing to effect. Would it pay to harry Mr. Cowperwood as he had set out to do? Would a steadfast policy advocating the cause of the people get him anywhere? Would they be grateful? Would they remember? Suppose the current policy of the newspapers should be modified, as Mr. Carker had suggested that it might be. What a mess and tangle politics really were. "Well, Bessie," he inquired of his handsome, healthy, semi-blonde wife one evening, "what would you do if you were I?" She was grey-eyed, gay, practical, vain, substantially connected in so far as family went, and proud of her husband's position and future. He had formed the habit of talking over his various difficulties with her. "Well, I'll tell you, Wally," she replied. "You've got to stick to something. It looks to me as though the winning side was with the people this time. I don't see how the newspapers can change now after all they've done. You don't have to advocate public ownership or anything unfair to the money element. But just the same, I'd stick to my point, that the 50-year franchise is too much. You ought to make them pay the city something and get their franchise without bribery. They can't do less than that. I'd stick to the course you've begun on. You can't get along without the people, Wally. You just must have them. If you lose their goodwill, the politicians can't help you much, nor anybody else." Plainly, there were times when the people had to be considered. They just had to be. Chapter 60. The Net. The storm which burst in connection with Cowperwood's machinations at Springfield early in 1897, and continued without abating until the following fall, attracted such general attention that it was largely reported in the Eastern papers. F.A. Cowperwood versus the state of Illinois. Thus, one New York daily phrased the situation. "The magnetizing power of fame is great. Who can resist utterly the luster that surrounds the individualities of some men, causing them to glow with a separate and special effulgence?" Even in the case of Bernice, this was not without its value. In a Chicago paper which she found lying one day on a desk which Cowperwood had occupied, was an extended editorial which interested her greatly. After reciting his various misdeeds, particularly in connection with the present state legislature, it went on to say, "He has an innate, chronic, uncontrollable contempt for the rank and file. Men are but slaves and thralls to draw for him the chariot of his greatness. Never in all his history has he seen fit to go to the people direct for anything. In Philadelphia, when he wanted public franchise control, he sought privily, and by chicane, to arrange his affairs with a venal city treasurer. In Chicago he has uniformly sought to buy and convert to his own use the splendid privileges of the city, which should really redound to the benefit of all. Frank Algernon Cowperwood does not believe in the people. He does not trust them. To him they constitute no more than a field upon which corn is to be sown, and from which it is to be reaped. They present but a mass of bent backs, their knees and faces in the mire, over which, as over a floor, he strides to superiority. His private and inmost faith is in himself alone. Upon the majority he shuts the gates of his glory, in order that the sight of their misery and their needs may not disturb nor alloy his selfish bliss.
Frank Algernon Cowperwood does not believe in the people. This editorial battle cry, flung aloft during the latter days of the contest at Springfield, and taken up by the Chicago papers generally, and by those elsewhere, interested Bernice greatly. As she thought of him, waging his terrific contests, hurrying to and fro between New York and Chicago, building his splendid mansion, collecting his pictures, quarreling with Aileen, he came, by degrees, to take on the outlines of a Superman, a half-god or demi-gorgon. How could the ordinary rules of life or the accustomed paths of men be expected to control him? They could not, and did not. And here he was, pursuing her, seeking her out with his eyes, grateful for a smile, waiting as much as he dared on her every wish and whim. Say what one will, the wish buried deep in every woman's heart is that her lover should be a hero. Some out of the veriest stick or stone fashion the idol before which they kneel. Others demand the hard reality of greatness. But in either case, the illusion of paragon worship is maintained. Bernice, by no means ready to look upon Cowperwood as an accepted lover, was nevertheless gratified that his erring devotion was the tribute of one able, apparently, to command thought from the whole world. Moreover, because the New York papers had taken fire from his great struggle in the Middle West, and were charging him with bribery, perjury, and intent to thwart the will of the people, Cowperwood now came forward with an attempt to explain his exact position to Bernice and to justify himself in her eyes. During visits to the Carter house, or in entr'actes at the opera or the theatre, he recounted to her, bit by bit, his entire history. He described the characters of Hand, Scryhart, Arneal, and the motives of jealousy and revenge which had led to their attack upon him in Chicago. No human being could get anything through the Chicago City Council without paying for it, he declared. It's simply a question of who's putting up the money. He told how Truman Leslie MacDonald had once tried to shake him down for $50,000, and how the newspapers had since found it possible to make money to increase their circulation by attacking him. He frankly admitted the fact of his social ostracism, attributing it partially to Aileen's deficiencies and partially to his own attitude of Promethean defiance, which had never yet brooked defeat. "And I will defeat them now," he said solemnly to Bernice one day over a luncheon table at the plaza, when the room was nearly empty. His grey eyes were a study in colossal, enigmatic spirit. "The governor hasn't signed my 50-year franchise bill." This was before the closing events at Springfield. "But he will sign it. Then I have one more fight ahead of me. I'm going to combine all the traffic lines out there under one general system. I am the logical person to provide it. Later on, if public ownership ever arrives, the city can buy it." "And then?" asked Bernice sweetly, flattered by his confidences. "Oh, I don't know. I suppose I'll live abroad. You don't seem to be very much interested in me. I'll finish my picture collection." "But supposing you should lose?" "I don't contemplate losing," he remarked coolly. "Whatever happens, I'll have enough to live on. I'm a little tired of contest." He smiled, but Bernice saw that the thought of defeat was a grey one. With victory was his heart, and only there. Owing to the national publicity being given to Cowperwood's affairs at this time, the effect upon Bernice of these conversations with him was considerable. At the same time, another and somewhat sinister influence was working in his favour. By slow degrees, she and her mother were coming to learn that the ultra-conservatives of society were no longer willing to accept them. Bernice had become, at last, too individual a figure to be overlooked. At an important luncheon given by the Harris Haggertys, some 5 months after the Beals-Chadsey affair, she had been pointed out to Mrs. Haggerty by a visiting guest from Cincinnati as someone with whom rumor was concerning itself. Mrs. Haggerty wrote to friends in Louisville for information, and received it. Shortly after, at the coming-out party of a certain Geraldine Borka, Bernice, who had been her sister's schoolmate, was curiously omitted. She took sharp note of that. Subsequently, the Haggertys failed to include her, as they had always done before, in their generous summer invitations. This was true also of the Lanman Zieglers and the Lucas Demigs. No direct affront was offered. She was simply no longer invited. Also, one morning she read in the Tribune that Mrs. Corscaden Batcher had sailed for Italy. No word of this had been sent to Bernice. Yet Mrs. Batcher was supposedly one of her best friends. A hint to some is of more avail than an open statement to others. Bernice knew quite well in which direction the tide was setting. True, there were a number, the ultra-smart of the smart world, who protested. Mrs. Patrick Gilhennin, for instance.
"No, you don't tell me. What a shame. Well, I like Bevy, and I shall always like her. She's clever, and she can come here just as long as she chooses. It isn't her fault. She's a lady at heart and always will be. Life is so cruel."
Mrs. Augustus Tabriz.
"Is that really true? I can't believe it. Just the same, she's too charming to be dropped. I for one propose to ignore these rumours just as long as I dare. She can come here if she can't go anywhere else."
Mrs. Pennington Drury.
"That of Bevy Fleming? Who says so? I don't believe it. I like her anyhow. The idea of the Haggertys cutting her, dull fools. Well, she can be my guest, the dear thing, as long as she pleases, as though her mother's career really affected her."
Nevertheless, in the world of the dull rich, those who hold their own by might of possession, conformity, owl-eyed sobriety, and ignorance, Bevy Fleming had become persona non grata. How did she take all this? With that air of superior consciousness which knows that no shift of outer material ill fortune can detract one jot from an inward mental superiority. The truly individual know themselves from the beginning, and rarely if ever doubt. Life may play fast and loose about them, running like a racing, destructive tide in and out, but they themselves are like a rock, still, serene, unmoved. Bevy Fleming felt herself to be so immensely superior to anything of which she was a part, that she could afford to hold her head high even now. Just the same, in order to remedy the situation, she now looked about her with an eye single to a possible, satisfactory marriage. Braxmar had gone for good. He was somewhere in the East, in China, she heard, his infatuation for her apparently dead. Kilmer Dwelma was gone also, snapped up, an acquisition on the part of one of those families who did not now receive her. However, in the drawing-rooms where she still appeared, and what were they but marriage markets, one or two affairs did spring up. Tentative approachments on the part of scions of wealth. They were destined to prove abortive. One of these youths, Pedro Reisa Mercado, a Brazilian educated at Oxford, promised much for sincerity and feeling, until he learned that Bernice was poor in her own right. And what else? Someone had whispered something in his ear. Again there was a certain William Drake Bowdoin, the son of a famous old family who lived on the north side of Washington Square. After a ball, a morning musicale, and one other affair at which they met, Bowdoin took Bernice to see his mother and sister, who were charmed. "Oh, you serene divinity," he said to her ecstatically one day. "Won't you marry me?" Bevy looked at him and wondered. "Let us wait just a little longer, my dear," she counselled. "I want you to be sure that you really love me." Shortly thereafter, meeting an old classmate at a club, Bowdoin was greeted as follows. "Look here, Bowdoin, you're a friend of mine. I see you with that Miss Fleming. Now, I don't know how far things have gone, and I don't want to intrude, but are you sure you are aware of all the aspects of the case?" "What do you mean?" demanded Bowdoin. "I want you to speak out." "Oh, pardon, old man, no offence, really. You know me. I couldn't. College and all that. Just this, though, before you go any further. Inquire about. You may hear things. If they're true, you ought to know. If not, the talking ought to stop. If I'm wrong, call on me for amends. I hear talk, I tell you. Best intentions in the world, old man, I do assure you." More inquiries. The tongues of jealousy and envy. Mr. Bowdoin was sure to inherit $3 million. Then a very necessary trip to somewhere, and Bernice stared at herself in the glass. What was it? What were people saying, if anything? This was strange. Well, she was young and beautiful. There were others. Still, she might have come to love Bowdoin. He was so airy, artistic in an unconscious way. Really, she had thought better of him. The effect of all this was not wholly depressing. Enigmatic, disdainful, with a touch of melancholy, and a world of gaiety and courage. Bernice heard at times behind joy the hollow echo of unreality. Here was a ticklish business, this living. For want of light and air, the finest flowers must die. Her mother's error was not so inexplicable now. By it had she not, after all, preserved herself and her family to a certain phase of social superiority? Beauty was of such substance as dreams are made of, and as fleeting. Not oneself alone. One's inmost worth, the splendor of one's dreams, but other things, name, wealth, the presence or absence of rumor and of accident, were important. Bernice's lip curled. But life could be lived. One could lie in the world. Youth is optimistic, and Bernice, in spite of her splendid mind, was so young. She saw life as a game, a good chance that could be played in many ways. Cowperwood's theory of things began to appeal to her. One must create one's own career, carve it out, or remain horribly dull or bored, dragged along at the chariot wheels of others. If society was so finicky, if men were so dull, well, there was one thing she could do. She must have life, and money would help some to that end. Besides, Cowperwood by degrees was becoming attractive to her. He really was. He was so much better than most of the others, so very powerful. She was preternaturally gay, as one who says, "Victory shall be mine anyhow." Chapter 61. The Cataclysm. And now, at last, Chicago is really facing the thing which it has most feared. A giant monopoly is really reaching out to enfold it with an octopus-like grip, and Cowperwood is its eyes, its tentacles, its force. Embedded in the giant strength and goodwill of Heckelheimer, Gottlieb & Co., he is like a monument based on a rock of great strength, a 50-year franchise, to be delivered to him by a majority of 48 out of a total of 68 aldermen, in case the ordinance has to be passed over the mayor's veto, is all that now stands between him and the realization of his dreams. What a triumph for his iron policy of courage in the face of all obstacles! What a tribute to his ability not to flinch in the face of storm and stress! Other men might have abandoned the game long before, but not he. What a splendid windfall of chance that the money element should of its own accord take fright at the Chicago idea of the municipalization of public privilege, and should hand him this giant South Side system as a reward for his stern opposition to folderol theories. Through the influence of these powerful advocates, he was invited to speak before various local commercial bodies, the Board of Real Estate Dealers, the Property Owners Association, the Merchants' League, the Bankers' Union, and so forth, where he had an opportunity to present his case and justify his cause. But the effect of his suave speechifyings in these quarters was largely neutralized by newspaper denunciation. "Can any good come out of Nazareth?" was the regular inquiry. That section of the press formerly beholden to Hand and Schryhart stood out as bitterly as ever, and most of the other newspapers, being under no obligation to Eastern capital, felt it the part of wisdom to support the rank and file. The most searching and elaborate mathematical examinations were conducted, with a view to showing the fabulous profits of the streetcar trust in future years. The fine hand of Eastern banking houses was detected, and their sinister motives noised abroad. "Millions for everybody in the trust, but not 1 cent for Chicago," was the inquirer's way of putting it. Certain altruists of the community were by now so aroused that in the destruction of Cowperwood they saw their duty to God, to humanity, and to democracy straight and clear. The heavens had once more opened, and they saw a great light. On the other hand, the politicians, those in office outside the mayor, constituted a petty band of guerrillas or freebooters who, like hungry swine shut in a pen, were ready to fall upon any and all propositions brought to their attention, with but one end in view, that they might eat, and eat heartily. In times of great opportunity and contest for privilege, life always sinks to its lowest depths of materialism, and rises at the same time to its highest reaches of the ideal. When the waves of the sea are most towering, its hollows are most awesome. Finally, the summer passed, the council assembled, and with the first breath of autumn chill, the very air of the city was touched by a premonition of contest. Cowperwood, disappointed by the outcome of his various ingratiatory efforts, decided to fall back on his old reliable method of bribery. He fixed on his price, $20,000 for each favorable vote to begin with. Later, if necessary, he would raise it to $25,000 or even $30,000, making the total cost in the neighborhood of $1.5 million. Yet it was a small price indeed, when the ultimate return was considered. He planned to have his ordinance introduced by an alderman named Ballenberg, a trusted lieutenant, and handed thereafter to the clerk, who could read it, whereupon another henchman would rise to move that it be referred to the Joint Committee on Streets and Alleys, consisting of 34 members, drawn from all the standing committees. By this committee it would be considered for 1 week in the General Council chamber, where public hearings would be held. By keeping up a bold front, Cowperwood thought the necessary iron could be put into his followers to enable them to go through with the scorching ordeal which was sure to follow. Already aldermen were being besieged at their homes and in the precincts of the ward clubs and meeting places. Their mail was being packed with importuning or threatening letters. Their very children were being derided, their neighbours urged to chastise them. Ministers wrote them in appealing or denunciatory vein. They were spied upon and abused daily in the public prints. The mayor, shrewd son of battle that he was, realizing that he had a whip of terror in his hands, excited by the long contest waged and by the smell of battle, was not backward in urging the most drastic remedies. "Wait till the thing comes up," he said to his friends in a great central music-hall conference in which thousands participated, and when the matter of ways and means to defeat the venal alderman was being discussed. "We have Mr. Cowperwood in a corner, I think. He cannot do anything for 2 weeks, once his ordinance is in, and by that time we shall be able to organize a vigilance committee, ward meetings, marching clubs, and the like. We ought to organize a great central mass meeting for the Sunday night before the Monday when the bill comes up for final hearing. We want overflowing meetings in every ward at the same time. I tell you, gentlemen, that while I believe there are enough honest voters in the city council to prevent the Cowperwood crowd from passing this bill over my veto, yet I don't think the matter ought to be allowed to go that far. You never can tell what these rascals will do once they see an actual cash bid of $20,000 or $30,000 before them. Most of them, even if they were lucky, would never make the half of that in a lifetime. They don't expect to be returned to the Chicago City Council. Once is enough. There are too many others behind them waiting to get their noses in the trough. Go into your respective wards and districts and organize meetings. Call your particular alderman before you. Don't let him evade you, or quibble, or stand on his rights as a private citizen or a public officer. Threaten, don't cajole. Soft or kind words won't go with that type of man. Threaten, and then, when you have managed to extract a promise, be on hand with ropes to see that he keeps his word. I don't like to advise arbitrary methods, but what else is to be done? The enemy is armed and ready for action right now. They're just waiting for a peaceful moment. Don't let them find it. Be ready. Fight. I am your mayor, and ready to do all I can. But I stand alone, with a mere pitiful veto right. You help me, and I'll help you. You fight for me, and I'll fight for you." Witness hereafter the discomforting situation of Mr. Simon Pinsky, at 9 p.m. on the second evening following the introduction of the ordinance, in the ward house of the 14th Ward Democratic Club. Rotund, flaccid, red-faced, his costume a long black frock coat and silk hat, Mr. Pinsky was being heckled by his neighbors and business associates. He had been called here by threats to answer for his prospective high crimes and misdemeanors. By now it was pretty well understood that nearly all the present aldermen were criminal and venal, and in consequence party enmities were practically wiped out. There were no longer for the time being Democrats and Republicans, but only pro- or anti-Cowperwoods, principally anti. Mr. Pinsky, unfortunately, had been singled out by the Transcript, the Inquirer, and the Chronicle as one of those open to advance questioning by his constituents. Of mixed Jewish and American extraction, he had been born and raised in the 14th, and spoke with a decidedly American accent. He was neither small nor large, sandy-haired, shifty-eyed, cunning, and on most occasions amiable. Just now he was decidedly nervous, wrathy, and perplexed, for he had been brought here against his will. His slightly oleaginous eyes, not unlike that of a small pig, had been fixed defiantly and finally on the munificent sum of $30,000, no less, and this local agitation threatened to deprive him of his almost unalienable right to the same. His ordeal took place in a large, low-ceilinged room, illuminated by 5 very plain, thin, 2-armed gas jets, suspended from the ceiling, and adorned by posters of prize fights, raffles, games, and the Simon Pinsky Pleasure Association, plastered here and there freely against dirty, long, unwhitewashed walls. He stood on the low, raised platform at the back of the room, surrounded by a score or more of his ward henchmen, all more or less reliable, all black-frocked, or at least in their Sunday clothes, all scowling, nervous, defensive, red-faced, and fearing trouble. Mr. Pinsky has come armed. This talk of the mayor's concerning guns, ropes, drums, marching clubs, and the like has been given very wide publicity, and the public seems rather eager for a Chicago holiday in which the slaughter of an alderman or so might furnish the leading and most acceptable feature. "Hey, Pinsky!" yells someone out of a small sea of new and decidedly unfriendly faces. This is no meeting of Pinsky followers, but a conglomerate outpouring of all those elements of a distrait populace, bent on enforcing for once the principles of aldermanic decency. There are even women here, local church members, and 1 or 2 advanced civic reformers and WCTU barroom smashers. Mr. Pinsky has been summoned to their presence by the threat that if he didn't come, the noble company would seek him out later at his own house. "Hey, Pinsky, you old boodler! How much do you expect to get out of this traction business?" This from a voice somewhere in the rear. Mr. Pinsky, turning to one side as if pinched in the neck. "The man that says I'm a boodler is a liar. I never took a dishonest dollar in my life, and everybody in the 14th Ward knows it." The 500 people assembled. "Ha, ha, ha! Pinsky never took a dollar! Ho, ho, ho! Whoopee!" Mr. Pinsky, red-faced, rising. "It is so. Why should I talk to a lot of loafers that come here because the papers tell them to call me names? I've been an alderman for 6 years now. Everybody knows me." A voice. "You call us loafers? You crook!" Another voice, referring to his statement of being known. "You bet they do." Another voice, this from a small, bony plumber in work clothes. "Hey, you old grafter! Which way do you expect to vote? For or against this franchise? Which way?" Still another voice, an insurance clerk. "Yes, which way?" Mr. Pinsky, rising once more, for in his nervousness he is constantly rising or starting to rise and then sitting down again. "I have a right to my own mind, ain't I? I got a right to think? What for am I an alderman, then? The Constitution—" An anti-Pinsky Republican, a young law clerk. "To hell with the Constitution! No fine words now, Pinsky. Which way do you expect to vote? For or against? Yes or no?" A voice, that of a bricklayer anti-Pinsky. "He daresn't say. He's got some of that bastard's money in his jeans now, I'll bet." A voice from behind, one of Pinsky's henchmen, a heavy, pugilistic Irishman. "Don't let 'em frighten you, Sim. Stand your ground. They can't hurt you, we're here." Pinsky, getting up once more. "This is an outrage, I say. Ain't I going to be allowed to say what I think? There are 2 sides to every question. Now I think whatever the newspapers say that Cowperwood—" A journeyman carpenter, a reader of the Enquirer. "You're bribed, you thief. You're beating about the bush. You want to sell out." The bony plumber. "Yes, you crook. You want to get away with $30,000, that's what you want, you boodler." Mr. Pinsky, defiantly, egged on by voices from behind. "I want to be fair, that's what. I want to keep my own mind. The Constitution gives everybody the right to free speech, even me. I insist that the streetcar companies have some rights. At the same time, the people have rights too." A voice. "What are those rights?" Another voice. "He don't know. He wouldn't know the people's rights from a sawmill." Another voice. "Or a load of hay." Pinsky, continuing very defiantly now since he has not yet been slain. "I say the people have their rights. The companies ought to be made to pay a fair tax. But this 20-year franchise idea is too little, I think. The Mears bill now gives them 50 years, and I think all told—" The 500 in chorus. "Oh, you robber! You thief! You boodler! Hang him! Ho, ho, ho! Get a rope! Pinsky, retreating within a defensive circle as various citizens approach him, their eyes blazing, their teeth showing, their fists clenched. My friends, wait! Ain't I going to be allowed to finish? A voice. We'll finish you, you stiff! A citizen, advancing, a bearded Pole. How will you vote, eh? Tell us that, how, eh? A second citizen, a Jew. You're a no-good robber. I know you for 10 years now already. You cheated me when you were in the grocery business. A third citizen, a Swede, in a sing-song voice. Answer me this, Mr. Pinsky. If a majority of the citizens of the 14th Ward don't want you to vote for it, will you still vote for it? Pinsky, hesitating. The 500. Oh, look at the scoundrel. He's afraid to say. He don't know whether he'll do what the people of his ward want. Oh, stand up, Pinsky. Don't be afraid. Pinsky, terrorized as the 500 make a rush for the stage. If the people don't want me to do it, of course I won't do it. Why should I? Ain't I their representative? A voice. Yes, when you think you're going to get the wadding kicked out of you. Another voice. You wouldn't be honest with your mother, you bastard. You couldn't be. Pinsky. If one half the voters should ask me not to do it, I wouldn't do it. A voice. Well, we'll get the votes to ask you, all right. We'll get 9/10 of them to sign before tomorrow night. An Irish-American, age 26, a gas collector, coming close to Pinsky. If you don't vote right, we'll hang you, and I'll be there to help pull the rope myself. One of Pinsky's lieutenants. Say, who is that freshie? We want to lay for him. One good kick in the right place will just about finish him. The gas collector. Not from you, you carrot-faced terrier. Come outside and see. Business of friends interfering. The meeting becomes disorderly. Pinsky is escorted out by friends, completely surrounded, amid shrieks and hisses, catcalls, cries of boodler, thief, robber. There were many such little dramatic incidents after the ordinance had been introduced. Henceforth, on the streets, in the wards and outlying sections, and even on occasion in the business heart, behold the marching clubs, those sinister, ephemeral organizations which on demand of the mayor had cropped out into existence, great companies of the unheralded, the dull, the undistinguished, clerks, working men, small business men, and minor scions of religion or morality, all tramping to and fro of an evening after working hours, assembling in cheap halls and party club-houses, and drilling themselves to what end? That they might march to the City Hall on the fateful Monday night, when the street railway ordinances should be up for passage, and demand of unregenerate lawmakers that they do their duty. Cowperwood, coming down to his office one morning, on his own elevated lines, was the observer of a button or badge worn upon the coat lapel of stolid, inconsequential citizens who sat reading their papers, unconscious of that presence which epitomized the terror and the power they all feared. One of these badges had for its device a gallows, with a free noose suspended. Another was emblazoned with the query, "Are we going to be robbed?" On signboards, fences, and dead walls, huge posters, 4 by 6 feet in dimension, were displayed. Walden H. Lucas against the Boodlers. Every citizen of Chicago should come down to the City Hall, tonight, Monday, December 12th, and every Monday night thereafter while the streetcar franchises are under consideration, and see that the interests of the city are protected against boodlism. Citizens, arouse and defeat the boodlers. In the papers were flaring headlines. In the club halls and churches fiery speeches could nightly be heard. Men were drunk now with a kind of fury of contest. They would not succumb to this Titan who was bent on undoing them. They would not be devoured by this Gorgon of the East. He should be made to pay an honest return to the city or get out. No 50-year franchise should be granted him. The Mayor's law must be repealed, and he must come into the city council humble and with clean hands. No alderman who received as much as $1 for his vote should in this instance be safe with his life. Needless to say that in the face of such a campaign of intimidation, only great courage could win. The aldermen were only human. In the council committee chamber, Cowperwood went freely among them, explaining as he best could the justice of his course, and making it plain that although willing to buy his rights, he looked on them as no more than his due. The rule of the council was barter, and he accepted it. His unshaken and unconquerable defiance heartened his followers greatly, and the thought of $30,000 was as a buttress against many terrors. At the same time, many an alderman speculated solemnly as to what he would do afterward, and where he would go once he had sold out. At last the Monday night arrived, which was to bring the final test of strength. Picture the large, ponderous structure of black granite, erected at the expense of millions, and suggesting somewhat the somnolent architecture of ancient Egypt, which served as the city hall and county courthouse combined. On this evening the 4 streets surrounding it were packed with thousands of people. To this throng Cowperwood had become an astounding figure. His wealth fabulous, his heart iron, his intentions sinister. The acme of cruel, plotting deviltry. Only this day the Chronicle, calculating well the hour and the occasion, has completely covered one of its pages with an intimate, though exaggerated description of Cowperwood's house in New York, his court of orchids, his sunrise room, the baths of pink and blue alabaster, the finishings of marble and intaglio. Here Cowperwood was represented as seated in a swinging divan, his various books, art treasures, and comforts piled about him. The idea was vaguely suggested that in his sybaritic hours, odalisques danced before him, and unnameable indulgences and excesses were perpetrated. At this same hour in the council chamber itself were assembling as hungry and bold a company of grey wolves as was ever gathered under one roof. The room was large, ornamented to the south by tall windows, its ceiling supporting a heavy, intricate chandelier, its 66 aldermanic desks, arranged in half circles, one behind the other, its woodwork of black oak, carved and highly polished, its walls a dark blue-grey, decorated with arabesques in gold, thus giving to all proceedings an air of dignity and stateliness. Above the speaker's head was an immense portrait in oil of a former mayor, poorly done, dusty, and yet impressive. The size and character of the place gave on ordinary occasions a sort of resonance to the voices of the speakers. Tonight, through the closed windows could be heard the sound of distant drums and marching feet. In the hall outside the council door were packed at least 1,000 men with ropes, sticks, a fife and drum corps, which occasionally struck up "Hail, Columbia, Happy Land," "My Country, 'Tis of Thee," and "Dixie." Alderman Schlumbohm, heckled to within an inch of his life, followed to the council door by 300 of his fellow citizens, was there left with an admonition that they would be waiting for him when he should make his exit. He was at last seriously impressed. "What is this?" he asked of his neighbour and nearest associate, Alderman Gavigan, when he gained the safety of his seat. "A free country?" "Search me," replied his compatriot wearily. "I never seen such a band as I have to deal with out in the 20th. Why, my God, a man can't call his name his own any more out here. It's got so now the newspapers tell everybody what to do." Alderman Pinsky and Alderman Hobercorn, conferring together in one corner, were both very dour. "I'll tell you what, Joe," said Pinsky to his confrere, "it's this fellow Lucas that has got the people so stirred up. I didn't go home last night because I didn't want those fellows to follow me down there. Me and my wife stayed downtown, but one of the boys was over there at Jake's a little while ago, and he says there must have been 500 people around my house at 6 o'clock already. What do you think of that?" "Same here. I don't take much stock in this lynching idea. Still, you can't tell. I don't know whether the police could help us much or not. It's a damned outrage. Cowperwood has a fair proposition. What's the matter with them anyhow?" Renewed sounds of marching through Georgia from without. Enter, at this time, Alderman Zina, Knudsen, Revere, Rogers, Tiernan, and Kerrigan. Of all the aldermen, perhaps, Messrs. Tiernan and Kerrigan were as cool as any. Still, the spectacle of streets blocked with people who carried torches and wore badges showing slip nooses attached to a gallows was rather serious. "I'll tell you, Pat," said Smiling Mike, as they eventually made the door through throngs of jeering citizens. "It does look a little rough. What do you think?" "To hell with them," replied Kerrigan, angry, waspish, determined. "They don't run me or my ward. I'll vote as I damn please." "Same here," replied Tiernan, with a great show of courage. "That goes for me. But it's pretty warm anyhow, eh?" "Yes, it's warm all right," replied Kerrigan, suspicious lest his companion in arms might be weakening. "But that'll never make a quitter out of me." Nor me either, replied the smiling one. Enter now the mayor, accompanied by a fife and drum corps rendering "Hail to the Chief." He ascends the rostrum. Outside in the halls, the huzzas of the populace. In the gallery overhead, a picked audience. As the various aldermen look up, they contemplate a sea of unfriendly faces. "Get on to the mayor's guests," commented one alderman to another cynically. A little sparring for time, while minor matters are considered, and the gallery is given opportunity for comment on the various communal lights, identifying for itself first one local celebrity and then another. There's Johnny Dowling, that big blond fellow with the round head. There's Pinsky. Look at the little rat. There's Kerrigan. Get on to the Emerald. Hey, Pat, how's the jewellery? You won't get any chance to do any grafting tonight, Pat. You won't pass no ordinance tonight. Alderman Winkler, pro Cowperwood. If the chair pleases, I think something ought to be done to restore order in the gallery and keep these proceedings from being disturbed. It seems to me an outrage that on an occasion of this kind, when the interests of the people require most careful attention— A voice. The interests of the people. Another voice. Sit down, you're bought. Alderman Winkler. If the chair pleases. The mayor. I shall have to ask the audience in the gallery to keep quiet in order that the business in hand may be considered. Applause, and the gallery lapses into silence. Alderman Giggler to Alderman Samulski. Well trained, eh? Alderman Ballenberg, pro Cowperwood, getting up. Large, brown, florid, smooth-faced. Before calling up an ordinance which bears my name, I should like to ask permission of the council to make a statement. When I introduced this ordinance last week, I said— A voice. We know what you said. Alderman Ballenberg. I said that I did so by request. I want to explain that it was at the request of a number of gentlemen who have since appeared before the committee of this council that now has this ordinance. A voice. That's all right, Ballenberg. We know by whose request you introduced it. You've said your little say. Alderman Ballenberg. If the chair pleases. A voice. Sit down, Ballenberg. Give some other boodler a chance. The mayor. Will the gallery please stop interrupting? Alderman Haverneck, jumping to his feet. This is an outrage. The gallery is packed with people come here to intimidate us. Here is a great public corporation that has served this city for years and served it well, and when it comes to this body with a sensible proposition, we ain't even allowed to consider it. The mayor packs the gallery with his friends, and the papers stir up people to come down here by thousands and try to frighten us. I, for one— A voice. What's the matter, Billy? Haven't you got your money yet? Alderman Haverneck, Polish-American, intelligent, even artistic-looking, shaking his fist at the gallery. You dare not come down here and say that, you coward! A chorus of 50 voices. Rats! Also, Billy, you ought to have wings! Alderman Tiernan, rising. I say now, Mr. Mayor, don't you think we've had enough of this? A voice. Well, look who's here, if it ain't Smiling Mike! Another voice. How much do you expect to get, Mike? Alderman Tiernan, turning to gallery. I want to say I can lick any man that wants to come down here and talk to me to my face. I'm not afraid of no ropes and no guns. These corporations have done everything for the city. A voice. Ah. Alderman Tiernan. If it wasn't for the streetcar companies, we wouldn't have any city. 10 voices. Ah. Alderman Tiernan bravely. My mind ain't the mind of some people. A voice. I should say not. Alderman Tiernan. I'm talking for compensation for the privileges we expect to give. A voice. You're talking for your pocketbook. Alderman Tiernan. I don't give a damn for these cheap skates and cowards in the gallery. I say treat these corporations right. They have helped make the city. A chorus of 50 voices. Ah! You want to treat yourself right, that's what you want. You vote right tonight, or you'll be sorry. By now, the various aldermen outside of the most hardened characters were more or less terrified by the grilling contest. It could do no good to battle with this gallery or the crowd outside. Above them sat the mayor, before them reporters, ticking in shorthand every phrase and word. I don't see what we can do, said Alderman Pinsky to Alderman Haverneck, his neighbour. It looks to me as if we might just as well not try. At this point arose Alderman Gilleran, small, pale, intelligent, anti-Cowperwood. By prearrangement he had been scheduled to bring the second, and as it proved, the final test of strength to the issue. "If the chair pleases," he said, "I move that the vote by which the Ballenberg 50-year ordinance was referred to the Joint Committee of Streets and Alleys be reconsidered, and that instead it be referred to the Committee on City Hall." This was a committee that hitherto had always been considered by members of council as of the least importance. Its principal duties consisted in devising new names for streets and regulating the hours of City Hall servants. There were no perquisites, no graft. In a spirit of ribald defiance at the organization of the present session, all the mayor's friends, the reformers, those who could not be trusted, had been relegated to this committee. Now it was proposed to take this ordinance out of the hands of friends and send it here, from whence, unquestionably, it would never reappear. The great test had come. Alderman Hobercorn, mouthpiece for his gang because the most skilful in a parliamentary sense. "The vote cannot be reconsidered." He begins a long explanation amid hisses. A voice. "How much have you got?" A second voice. "You've been a boodler all your life." Alderman Hobercorn, turning to the gallery, a light of defiance in his eyes. "You come here to intimidate us, but you can't do it. You're too contemptible to notice." A voice. "You hear the drums, don't you?" A second voice. "Vote wrong, Hobercorn, and see. We know you." Alderman Tiernan to himself. "Say, that's pretty rough, ain't it?" The mayor. "Motion overruled. The point is not well taken." Alderman Giggler, rising, a little puzzled. "Do we vote now on the Gilleran resolution?" A voice. "You bet you do, and you vote right." The mayor. "Yes. The clerk will call the roll." The clerk, reading the names, beginning with the A's. Altfast. Pro Cowperwood. Alderman Altfast. Yea. Fear had conquered him. Alderman Tiernan to Alderman Carrigan. "Well, that's one baby down." Alderman Carrigan. "Yep." Ballenberg. Pro Cowperwood, the man who had introduced the ordinance. "Yea." Alderman Tiernan. "Say, has Ballenberg weakened?" Alderman Carrigan. "It looks that way." Cana. "Yea." Fogarty. "Yea." Alderman Tiernan, nervously. "There goes Fogarty." Haverneck. "Yea." Alderman Tiernan. "And Haverneck." Alderman Carrigan, referring to the courage of his colleagues. "It's coming out of their hair." In exactly 80 seconds the roll call was in, and Cowperwood had lost, 41 to 25. It was plain that the ordinance could never be revived. Chapter 62. The Recompense. You have seen, perhaps, a man whose heart was weighted by a great woe. You have seen the eye darken, the soul fag, and the spirit congeal under the breath of an icy disaster. At 10:30 of this particular evening, Cowperwood, sitting alone in the library of his Michigan Avenue house, was brought face to face with the fact that he had lost. He had built so much on the cast of this single die. It was useless to say to himself that he could go into the council a week later with a modified ordinance, or could wait until the storm had died out. He refused himself these consolations. Already he had battled so long and so vigorously, by every resource and subtlety which his mind had been able to devise. All week long, on divers occasions, he had stood in the council chamber where the committee had been conducting its hearings. Small comfort to know that by suits, injunctions, appeals, and writs to intervene, he could tie up this transit situation, and leave it for years and years the prey of lawyers, the despair of the city, a hopeless muddle, which would not be unravelled until he and his enemies should long be dead. This contest had been so long in the brewing, he had gone about it with such care years before, and now the enemy had been heartened by a great victory. His aldermen, powerful, hungry, fighting men all, like those picked soldiers of the ancient Roman emperors, ruthless, conscienceless, as desperate as himself, had in their last redoubt of personal privilege fallen, weakened, yielded. How could he hearten them to another struggle? How face the blazing wrath of a mighty populace that had once learned how to win? Others might enter here, Heckelheimer, Fischel, any of a half-dozen eastern giants, and smooth out the ruffled surface of the angry sea that he had blown to fury. But as for him, he was tired, sick of Chicago, sick of this interminable contest. Only recently he had promised himself that if he were to turn this great trick, he would never again attempt anything so desperate or requiring so much effort. He would not need to. The size of his fortune made it of little worth. Besides, in spite of his tremendous vigor, he was getting on. Since he had alienated Aileen, he was quite alone, out of touch with anyone identified with the earlier years of his life. His all-desired Bernice still evaded him. True, she had shown lately a kind of warming sympathy. But what was it? Gracious tolerance, perhaps? A sense of obligation? Certainly little more, he felt. He looked into the future, deciding heavily that he must fight on whatever happened, and then, while he sat thus, drearily pondering, answering a telephone call now and then, the doorbell rang, and the servant brought a card, which he said had been presented by a young woman who declared that it would bring immediate recognition. Glancing at it, Cowperwood jumped to his feet and hurried downstairs into the one presence he most craved. There are compromises of the spirit too elusive and subtle to be traced in all their involute windings. From the earliest day when Bernice Fleming had first set eyes on Cowperwood, she had been moved by a sense of power, an amazing and fascinating individuality. Since then, by degrees, he had familiarized her with a thought of individual freedom of action, and a disregard of current social standards, which were destructive to an earlier conventional view of things. Following him through this Chicago fight, she had been caught by the wonder of his dreams. He was on the way toward being one of the world's greatest money giants. During his recent trips east, she had sometimes felt that she was able to read in the cast of his face the intensity of this great ambition, which had, for its ultimate aim, herself. So he had once assured her. Always with her he had been so handsome, so pleading, so patient. So here she was in Chicago tonight, the guest of friends at the Richelieu, and standing in Cowperwood's presence. "Why, Bernice," he said, extending a cordial hand. "When did you arrive in town? Whatever brings you here?" He had once tried to make her promise that if ever her feeling toward him changed, she would let him know of it in some way. And here she was tonight. On what errand? He noted her costume of brown silk and velvet, how well it seemed to suggest her cat-like grace. "You bring me here," she replied, with an indefinable something in her voice, which was at once a challenge and a confession. "I thought from what I had been just reading, that you might really need me now." "You mean?" he inquired, looking at her with vivid eyes. Then he paused. "That I've made up my mind. Besides, I ought to pay some time." "Bernice!" he exclaimed reproachfully. "No, I don't mean that either," she replied. "I'm sorry now. I think I understand you better. Besides," she added with a sudden gaiety that had a touch of self-consolation in it, "I want to." "Bernice? Truly?" "Can't you tell?" she queried. "Well, then," he smiled, holding out his hands, and to his amazement she came forward. "I can't explain myself to myself quite," she added in a hurried, low, eager tone, "but I couldn't stay away any longer. I had the feeling that you might be going to lose here for the present, but I want you to go somewhere else if you have to. London or Paris. The world won't understand us quite, but I do." "Bernice!" He smothered her cheek and hair. "Not so close, please. And there aren't to be any other ladies, unless you want me to change my mind." "Not another one, as I hope to keep you. You will share everything I have." For answer, how strange are realities as opposed to illusion. In retrospect. The world is dosed with too much religion. Life is to be learned from life, and the professional moralist is at best but a manufacturer of shoddy wares. At the ultimate remove, God, or the life force, if anything, is an equation, and at its nearest expression for man, the contract social, it is that also. Its method of expression appears to be that of generating the individual in all his glittering variety and scope, and through him progressing to the mass with its problems. In the end, a balance is invariably struck wherein the mass subdues the individual, or the individual the mass, for the time being. For behold, the sea is ever dancing or raging. In the meantime there have sprung up social words and phrases expressing a need of balance, of equation. These are right, justice, truth, morality, an honest mind, a pure heart, all words meaning a balance must be struck. The strong must not be too strong, the weak not too weak. But without variation, how could the balance be maintained? Nirvana, nirvana, the ultimate still equation. Rushing like a great comet to the zenith, his path a blazing trail, Cowperwood did for the hour illuminate the terrors and wonders of individuality. But for him also the eternal equation, the pathos of the discovery that even giants are but pygmies, and that an ultimate balance must be struck. Of the strange, tortured, terrified reflection of those who, caught in his wake, were swept from the normal and commonplace, what shall we say? Legislators by the hundred, who were hounded from politics into their graves, a half-hundred aldermen of various councils who were driven grumbling or whining into the limbo of the dull, the useless, the commonplace, a splendid governor, dreaming of an ideal on the one hand, succumbing to material necessity on the other, traducing the spirit that aided him the while he tortured himself with his own doubts. A second governor, more amenable, was to be greeted by the hisses of the populace, to retire brooding and discomfited, and finally to take his own life. Scry heart and hand, venomous men both, unable to discover whether they had really triumphed, were to die eventually puzzled. A mayor, whose greatest hour was in thwarting one who condemned him, lived to say, "It is a great mystery. He was a strange man." A great city struggled for a score of years to untangle that which was all but beyond the power of solution, a true Gordian knot. And this giant himself, rushing on to new struggles and new difficulties in an older land, forever suffering the goad of a restless heart, for him was no ultimate peace, no real understanding, but only hunger and thirst and wonder. Wealth, wealth, wealth. A new grasp of a new great problem and its eventual solution. Anew the old urgent thirst for life, and only its partial quenchment. In Dresden, a palace for one woman. In Rome, a second for another. In London, a third for his beloved Bernice, the lure of beauty ever in his eye. The lives of two women wrecked, a score of victims despoiled. Bernice herself, weary yet brilliant, turning to others for recompense for her lost youth. And he, resigned and yet not, loving, understanding, doubting, caught at last by the drug of a personality which he could not gainsay. What shall we say of life in the last analysis? Peace be still? Or shall we battle sternly for that equation which we know will be maintained whether we battle or no, in order that the strong become not too strong, or the weak not too weak? Or perchance shall we say, sick of dullness, enough of this, I will have strong meat or die, and die, or live? Each according to his temperament, that something which he has not made and cannot always subdue, and which may not always be subdued by others for him. Who plans the steps that lead lives on to splendid glories, or twist them into gnarled sacrifices, or make of them dark, disdainful, contentious tragedies? The soul within? And whence comes it? Of God? What thought engendered the spirit of Circe, or gave to a Helen the lust of tragedy? What lit the walls of Troy, or prepared the woes of Andromache? By what demon counsel was the fate of Hamlet prepared, and why did the weird sisters plan ruin to the murderous Scot? Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. In a mulch of darkness are bedded the roots of endless sorrows, and of endless joys. Canst thou fix thine eye on the morning? Be glad, and if in the ultimate it blind thee, be glad also. Thou hast lived.